Gamers love fear. They love games that let you navigate spooky spaces, run and hide from spooky enemies, and be challenged by incredibly evil antagonists. People are super passionate about their scary games. I know this firsthand because despite not caring for scary games at all, my most popular video to date is my System Shock series review, where I cover a pair of underrated PC games that tick all those boxes. My 5-hour Thief series review is up there too. But gamers also love F.E.A.R, Monolith's technically impressive first-person action game from 2005, debuting exclusively on the PC. F.E.A.R mashes together what looks and plays like a Tom Clancy Paranormal Squad tactical shooter, Max Payne's John Woo-inspired slow-mo gameplay, with a J-horror-inspired little girl as the game's big bad. It also features goal-oriented artificial intelligence, so enemies will flank you or resort to a variety of other unique maneuvers to get in or out of your way, like crashing through windows. I don't want to brag too much, but I did get to play the demo for this at E3 2005 alongside Monolith's Xbox 360 exclusive horror brawler Condemned Criminal Origins. The original F.E.A.R was lightning in a bottle, a tight combination of gameplay and horror released at the right time. It established a passionate fan base and, most importantly, it sold well. This means that what could have effectively been a standalone game with a vague, incomplete storyline was dragged out with a raft of inconsistent expansions and sequels that chased the vapors of the successful first entry. It's a tale as old as time. These lesser F.E.A.Rs were also crippled by a corporate divorce that complicated what each new entry could cover, what characters could be included, and what studio made them, producing the series' inconsistent gameplay and aesthetic from game to game too. Within a decade of striking a chord, the series had run out of fuel, or more appropriately, been drained of all of its blood. So where did the first game in this action horror series detailing Alma's fiery, supernatural revenge go so incredibly right? And despite its missteps, did the series truly deserve to crash and burn on the indifference of gamers and critics alike? Let's find out. It may not be the first, but it is the nth review, number 26 for the F.E.A.R series, brought to you by my patrons at patreon.com/the nth review. Sign up to become a free member today. There's an unspoken rule that you can't have an action game without a properly authenticated action protagonist. F.E.A.R employs the Point Man, whose name is literally Point Man, an unseen and unheard badass army dude. For now. He serves as the series' player protagonist for most of the entries in this series, but not all. He's no Gordon Freeman, but his special and supernatural powers justify all of the badass stuff that you'll be able to pull off and experience. Series-defining special supernatural powers, what might those be, Nick? Well, imagine for a moment that you had the creepy ability to experience horrific psychic visions and hallucinations at random intervals while on the job. And what if you knew that these horrific visions came to you because you are a Nepo hire directly related to the series' biggest characters? It's something the first game holds close to its chest, but I'll spoil it a bit later. Combined, these grant the game the ability to tell its story and make your otherwise lukewarm vanilla milk protagonist a meaningfully important character to the events going on around him. But who cares about storylines and narrative function? Let's talk about bullet time. Reflex time. Actually, let's just call it slow-mo. It's fewer syllables. With a tap of a button, time grinds to a crawl, and you can blow up dudes with supreme temporal advantage. It's very cool to watch your slow-moving opponents struggle to do their stuff as you're unloading magazine after magazine into them. It's even better when you can get the drop on them. Your boss at F.E.A.R explains that these are your incredible reflexes at play, but it's really tied to that other stuff with the horrific visions and terrible nightmares. In F.E.A.R's first few intervals, which are what they call chapters in this series, slow-mo initially felt like a cheat considering all the other tactical combat options you have available to you. Eventually, it became a necessary tool as enemies grew in quantity and capability. If you're familiar with the Max Payne games, F.E.A.R's slow-mo functions similarly to the first game. Once activated, the slow-mo meter runs down until it exhausts entirely, or you deactivate it, at which point it begins recharging. Slow-mo is clearly not a new mechanic anymore. I mean, there had already been 2 Max Payne games, right? But when F.E.A.R dropped in 2005 with how they approached it, it was a big deal. Of course, one quality of life feature I wish these games had was an auto reload before entering slow-mo. I would often enter slow-mo with an empty magazine and, far more times than I can count, immediately need to reload, unable to shoot the bad guy I was pointing at. Is there a boomer shooter with slow-mo that doesn't have any reload mechanics at all? Or to borrow from Max Payne 2, the ability to replenish your slow-mo meter as you kill dudes, enabling slow-motion chains of kills? I don't know. Drop a title in the comments. While Point Man serves as the protagonist of most of these F.E.A.R titles, sometimes he doesn't. This makes it extremely odd when those other individual titles simply give you Point Man's special abilities without establishing why those characters have them. While F.E.A.R 2 eventually gets to it, F.E.A.R's second expansion, Perseus Mandate, doesn't, and that's okay because Perseus Mandate is... well, let's just say it ranks among the lesser issues that expansion has. Being a badass that's pivotal to the events of the series' lore is important because there's nothing to your character otherwise. You also spend the vast majority of your time in this series operating alone against swarms of enemies in hostile environments. Let's just say that Point Man isn't going to appear in the roster of a multi-property arcade brawler anytime soon. F.E.A.R, or First Encounter Assault Recon, is a bespoke U.S. Army unit tasked with mitigating paranormal threats through a combination of firepower and forensic investigation, but mostly firepower. As the first game opens, this group appears to be a handful of people at most, but Perseus Mandate places you in a second F.E.A.R team, so I mean, it can't be that big. Despite having the marquee role, there's no sense of why these F.E.A.R people are here doing this, what their skills are, what the mission of this entity is, or why they're better equipped to handle paranormal disturbances than anyone else. Are they just doing combat drills between Friday night screenings of Ghostbusters and The Thing? The series dances around what other paranormal chores such a unit keeps busy with by kicking off the first game with a mission that sucks up all of the air in the room. If you think subsequent games will be interested in elaborating on the lore of the F.E.A.R unit, you'll be very disappointed. Instead, F.E.A.R as a series is really about the far bigger moves that have been happening between the Department of Defense and the evil, multi-tentacled corporation Armacam since the 1960s. Long story short, Armacam has developed an army of clone soldiers called replicas, who are led by a powerful psychic commander named Paxton Fettel. This is an expensive, coordinated effort to eliminate the tactical lag between order and action on the battlefield. In 2005, this may have seemed like a practical military experiment in an era before capable drones, but today it seems like an inefficient and expensive way to build a fighting force. Ironically, its high-speed drones with high-powered energy weapons wind up being the most annoying enemies in the whole series, even if they're more science fiction than today's deadly quadcopters and conventional aircraft. While this already seems like a terribly unethical way to build an army, it gets worse as the first game opens on Fettel going rogue with his troops in the most violently cannibalistic way possible. This handily allows the game, and the series as a whole, to have you fight a seemingly endless parade of replica troops, because Armacam sure made a bunch of them. Fettel plays a primary role in this series, so I'll admit right up front that I don't really care for Fettel's portrayal at all, or his writing or voice direction. I just don't buy him as a serious character, even as he appears over and over again through the series. It's nothing against actor Peter Sheary, I just didn't care for his mustache-twirling evilness that's unfulfilling as an ironic portrayal and cringy as a serious one. It stands at odds with how the other characters of this universe are played straight in comparison.
The war has begun, just as I dreamed it would, just as I foresaw.
This clone army and psychic commander setup is derived from a collection of different Armacam projects that are revealed over the course of the series. Of course, if you're just playing the first game, you're not going to experience much of this because it doesn't spend much of its bandwidth trying to reveal a story. Project Origin, which became the name of the second game, is the program that tamed the powerful psychic Alma Wade's psionic powers so that she could be bred to create the aforementioned psychic commanders. Not helping anything is that she's portrayed throughout the series as a young girl, and some of the genetic material used to impregnate her as a teenager came from Origin project lead Harlan Wade, who was, her dad. Just freaking you. Cannibalistic Commander Paxton Fettel is one of the outcomes of Project Origin, and he becomes the star of Project Perseus, which empowers him to become a psychic commander. The only successful candidate, it turns out. Actually, maybe not. Project Paragon is Armacam's decades-long approach to creating a psychic commander without the need for Alma by poisoning kids with psychic chemicals in control groups within an elementary school environment. It's the same environment that determined that Alma had a high psychic midichlorian count, making her eligible to be spun off into her own project. Similar to Paragon, Project Harbinger is Armacam trying to create another psychic commander without Alma's intervention by inserting psychic antenna into people's brains. This is how your character in F.E.A.R 2 has Point Man slow-mo ability and no one else does. Actually, why do none of your squad mates in that game have it? Or do they? There are a couple more, but the lore of Armacam doesn't really deserve too much more of a dive. It certainly wasn't a priority for the games to begin with. F.E.A.R works hard to establish Armacam's overwhelming evilness by stamping its logo everywhere, perhaps not all that differently than how Resident Evil visually celebrates its nefarious umbrella corporation. Armacam's connected tri-square can be found on walls, in promotional posters, it forms a number of industrial sculptures, it's in playgrounds, it's just freaking everywhere, imposing its brand of evil corporate imperialism. To that end, should you decide to play all or even most of the entries in this series, you're going to tour a lot of Armacam's real estate in the form of endless office spaces, server rooms, and laboratories. To combat this tedium, quite ironically, you'll be fighting swarms of generic-looking soldiers, and not just the replicas. You see, it's not long into the first game that Armacam sicks its security forces on you for meddling with their affairs. Initially, their fighting forces look different, like private security dudes defending corporate offices, but eventually they all just look like armored thick men with long rifles and then generic mecha soldiers led by super commanders. Many of the game's conflicts involve Armacam and Fettel's replica troops, and it's difficult to discern between them. Of course, this makes for some moments where you can just sit back and watch them shoot each other up. Inevitably, you just kinda end up being a meddler in the affairs of both factions. What this really amounts to is a whole bunch of combatants that you're shooting at who look and function identically. This becomes a liability in Perseus Mandate, the expansion that introduces AI buddies that you can fight alongside, because friendly fire is alive and well there. But even if generic soldier dudes of different stripes wind up being the vast majority of the people that you insert ammunition into, the games aren't entirely unambitious. There are those drones, but then there are also high-tech, high-speed, hyper-agile Armacam weirdos in and out of body armor that require your slow-mo ability to compete with. The games introduce heavily armored mini-boss troopers and full-on mechs at a point, but they still feel germane to the goings-on in this universe. And then the game will play with supernatural opponents that, if you consider them for too long, make you question how they fit into the affairs of Alma or the game's supernatural order. Like, here are these guys that just mob you from black holes, or these invisible weirdos in Extraction Point, or these, supernatural dogs in the third game. I guess I don't follow the logic behind any of the supernatural foes in these games. At the end of the day, you're slashing and slow-moing through hordes of similar-looking enemy combatants with a seemingly endless supply of blood to paint levels with. This series also has a really big issue with helicopters and keeping them airborne and intact, despite them being a popular method of transportation between intervals. But something you'll encounter relatively quick playing these games is that despite there always being some objective driving you forward, the storytelling is very wispy, even as technology and production budgets allow for more. Like a LaCroix, the flavor is apparent as a full experience, but nearly imperceptible with each individual sip. Even the first game will do a story dump between intervals to keep you up to date, so you're not entirely lost wondering why you're committing to another hour or two of gameplay. While this is enough to keep you pointed in the right direction, you'll complete any of these games and still be left with big questions about what you actually accomplished. Alma Wade is the hook that the F.E.A.R series hangs all of its horror ambitions on, the hyper-telepathic thread that ties the entire franchise together. She looms over the key art of all the F.E.A.R entries that matter. As the series progresses, she's portrayed interchangeably as a small, scary girl with blood-stained legs, an ancient hag, and a pregnant adult. What role she materializes as seems purely dependent on what the series feels will get the creepiest reaction out of the player. This always felt arbitrary, even borderline manipulative, with little to no rhyme or reason. But even as the series tries to fill in the gaps in the narrative, Alma's story never really seemed to amount to much when she did get some narrative attention. Harlan Wade treats Alma, his daughter, and her children as psionic instruments to be shaped and trained into pure, more powerful states. Why? So they can become more effective weapons, or gods as he puts it.
You will be a god among men.
Through his scientific and bureaucratic musculature at Armacam. Also, it's because he's a fucking psychopath. But in hammering Alma and her children like Paxton Fettel into the shapes he desires, he manages to lose control of them. Somehow, through all of his efforts, with all of Armacam's resources, they run amok. Alma is rendered comatose and then placed in a giant vault. Despite this, her psychic presence cannot be caged, something Harlan doesn't appreciate. But even playing the original F.E.A.R, it's clear that there's little logic that ties all this together. So much of what I've told you about Alma and Harlan and Armacam's chorus of evil projects is something that had to be scraped together well after the fact. Moment to moment, everything you encounter, all the scares the game tosses at you, just feel like an arbitrary series of events designed to pull you down a scare tunnel. You may be thinking, as Alma liquefies your coworkers into skeletons, why does she do all this? Why does any of this happen? Why is there so much arbitrary violence in here? What are these supernatural creatures, and why do they take the forms they do? I can't tell you because F.E.A.R doesn't tell you. And then there's the plot stuff when it does pop up. Why does the game spend so much energy having you find, liberate, and then protect Harlan's other daughter, Alice, who is not Alma, and then do nothing but have her nephew Paxton brutally murder her? Why do Alice and the other women in this series feel like rushing way ahead of the player protagonists, placing them in terrible danger? The first two F.E.A.R games make some attempt to hide some world building in industry standard audio logs, which are something I talk about at length in my System Shock series review. Here, they take the form of voicemails and laptop data dumps that your boss safely interprets from afar, filling in some logic holes when taken as a whole. Like audio logs, however, if you don't find them, you don't gain their knowledge, and F.E.A.R feels no pressure to place any along the critical path. And exclusive to the first game are little prey-like radio broadcasts explaining the civilian perspective of events happening in Fairport, the city you're blasting through. It's such a fun little touch that the series as a whole really should have taken better advantage of. After completing these games, the allure of diving into online wikis for background information became impossible to ignore. Even Monolith seemed to understand this, so for F.E.A.R 2, they crafted a data dump called the Armacam Field Guide, a pre-order bonus that finds life these days as a forgotten PDF. I have to say that despite the best efforts of the writers to use this document to world build, the designers didn't seem quite as enthusiastic. The handwritten notes in the margins by Armacam CEO use the cheesiest font that they could find. It truly looks like a fake document designed to look like a real-world document in the aughts. My point is, understanding what the hell is going on in the F.E.A.R series, especially in the original game, required going so far from the experience of actually playing the games that it felt like homework. This is passive-aggressive storytelling at its worst. You shouldn't have to consult an entirely separate form of transmedia entertainment to make sense of what's going on here. And look, I get it, you're not playing these for the story. That doesn't excuse it by any means, but it would have helped because most of your playtime in these games is wandering down dark hallways while shooting dudes. Maybe there's a F.E.A.R fan group out there who truly enjoys the lore of Alma, Harlan, Fettel, and the Armacam Empire and wish for some future adventure that allows them to ride once more, but I mean, come on guys, there's better stuff out there. It would be easier to make peace with the strong lack of lore if these games were actually scary. If these were sturdier studies of characters with sensible explored motivations, that'd be one thing, but the air quotes horror of the F.E.A.R games is built on tropes that don't amount to much otherwise. There are jump scares in here, liberal amounts of blood as set dressing, the casual liquefaction of your coworkers and enemies alike, and every horror trope you can imagine. The reliance on cheap, predictable thrills makes the horror feel like it was clipped out of a sheet and then reassembled in the game. This underlines the fact that there aren't any deeper psychological elements of tension here. There is no string being plucked to put you on edge because there just isn't one. Alma is no Shodan. Even when she's inside your head feeding you visions, it's arbitrary and only weakly conveys the idea that you're still experiencing any kind of narrative progression. There's no sense that the horror is coming for you personally because you have to be the observer of the vicious, evil things happening to everyone around you. Death would be too easy. Unfortunately, even when these games try to be horrific, they just can't. It would put the games at odds with all the supernatural combat you get to pull off, which is far more likely the reason why you checked them out to begin with, not the scary little girl bloody bits. The series isn't completely devoid of tension, but should you dare to tread beyond the first game, you'll notice that even the tentative sense of dread that F.E.A.R produces wanes with each entry. The first game's unrealistic, high-contrast lighting produced some genuinely creepy scenes on occasion, like the descent into the Project Origin vault at the game's climax, which still feels like the tensest moment in the entire series. Even the expansions with their lesser budgets and half-baked designs produced an unsettling feeling that they don't abide by the rules, like a chaotic dream. But by the third game, Paxton Fettel is your snarky co-op buddy in a vibrant-looking action game. The series grants you a flashlight to flush out the darkness. In the first game, it has a charge that depletes and then quickly recharges, which is actually kind of annoying mechanically. F.E.A.R 2 and 3 ditch that silliness, but they also produce far fewer reasons for the player to use it as they embrace lower contrast lighting. The flashlight also becomes a liability as enemies can spot its beam and then point their guns at you and then shoot at you. But again, this feels like less of a threat the further into the series you progress. Are you noticing a trend? There are those who would argue, as some meek last-string defense, that Monolith never intended their games to have good, cohesive horror, because they're Hong Kong action flick-inspired shooters first. And I'd say that the sheer amount of effort put into making these games scary disagrees with that entirely. They tried to pull off something in here to jingle your creepy nerves, and I don't think they ever pulled it off. Between 5 entries, plus a bunch more retail SKUs, the F.E.A.R series did not sell some incredible amount of units. Its critical reception was middling beyond the first game. No one remembers who Point Man is. Alma Wade, despite her clear similarities to the Ring Samara, did not become a household name or nerd convention staple. 2 decades after its debut, F.E.A.R holds literal cultural cachet. Each mainline game features multiplayer modes that are now long dead, drained of willing participants. Entry after entry, I encountered empty server listings. The fact that this game, an iconic shooter, lacked a single soul to casually play with reminded me that so many games of this era had multiplayer modes forced into them to prolong their departure from the conversations of casual gamers, their discs left to sit in plastic tombs forevermore. Playing F.E.A.R 3 cooperatively with Mr. Shotsky of the Primordial Chronicles, go check him out and subscribe, reminded me why publishers lean on live service models now. No developer wants to build a multiplayer-focused game that doesn't catch on. They want a persistent, passionate audience to justify an ongoing treadmill of new content as the game ages. F.E.A.R Online, we'll pull down that asterisk from earlier, was Warner's experiment with live service in the F.E.A.R-niverse that was only available to play for less than a year after its 2014 debut. Needless to say, I wasn't able to check it out for this review. So now that we've set the stage, it's time to move on to F.E.A.R's first act, one that turned out to be very difficult to follow.
Hey bro, what took you so long? Try to find a way around.
In the words of 20th century pop rock band 9 Days, F.E.A.R is the story of a girl who cried a river and drowned the whole world, and while she looks so sad in photographs, I absolutely love her when she smiles. Which is never. F.E.A.R opens with alarms blaring as F.E.A.R and his army of clone troopers overtake an Alma facility. With the utmost urgency, you need to kill your way through swaths of replicas on your way to take out F.E.A.R. And when I say the utmost urgency, I mean your boss drops you off at the crime scene like your roommate would drop you off for a shift at Safeway.
Jankowski, you in position?
Just say the word.
All right, move it out.
It should be no surprise to you after all my gripes about the series' wafer-thin storytelling that this game is a game-length chase. Your target perpetually 10 minutes ahead of you. You're chasing after Rogue Commander F.E.A.R, who in turn is chasing after Alma, the little girl who's causing all kinds of violent trouble, who also happens to be his mom. The story concludes as Harlan Wade tries to liberate Alma and she liquefies him. You reach F.E.A.R, and before you upload a bullet into his forehead, he reveals that he's your brother, which makes you both the children of Alma. It turns out you weren't Psychic Commander material like him, so they plot-holed Point Man into becoming Neo from the Matrix and placed him in the US Army, then the F.E.A.R unit. But you're not deep underground in Armacam's terrifying facility for a family reunion, you're there to blow it up, so hopefully Alma goes away and the psychic nightmare can end forever. You do just that, and then you realize that no, this is not how this is going to work. F.E.A.R succeeded in 2005 in huge part because it took advantage of its PC exclusivity to demonstrate what the bleeding edge of graphical and AI technology looked and played like. This was during a time when any technically minded game could seemingly reinvent what was possible, but F.E.A.R also demonstrates that it's a product of its era in ways that are a bit less flattering. If you were playing PC games back then, you made sure that your quick save key was conveniently mapped. In an era before more convenient checkpointing, you might find yourself unintentionally save-scumming encounters kill by kill to avoid losing a bunch of progress after a haphazard death. This isn't exclusive to F.E.A.R by any means, but it winds up being an outlier among the latter, more mainline games in this series. The game's campaign feels quaintly simple and straightforward, almost lacking in features. It's also not immune to cringe, like listening to the soldier you connect with late in the game hitting on your coworker immediately after your helicopter crashes.
It's you I'm worried about.
Yeah, I'm fine. As long as I don't move.
Just let me know if you need a little mouth-to-mouth.
Don't make me laugh.
You think I'm joking?
And then there's another incredibly common issue with playing PC games of this era today, namely getting them to work at all, especially on higher resolution displays in aspect ratios that didn't really exist yet. But enough bitching and moaning, this game was a technical tour de force 20 years ago. It's pretty incredible that Doom creator id and F.E.A.R producer Monolith made games that look so incredibly similar despite being developed independently of each other with their own proprietary technologies. If you were none the wiser, you might assume that F.E.A.R and Doom 3 were running the same engine, although the environments of Monolith's game are a little bit more spare than id's. Both games are defined by extremely sharp lighting, courtesy stencil shadows, a CPU-intensive process. The visual effect of these ultra-hard-edged shadows is heightened by playing in higher resolutions. These are, unfortunately, a graphical technology dead end, and a firm reminder of a future that would never come. I chat about them a bit more in my Prey 2006 review, one of the last mainstream games to use them, in my recollection. Like Doom 3, every surface seems to have a slightly glazed, damp clay look to it. This carries over to the human models, making them look about as creepy as anything the game intended you to be freaked out about. There are also plenty of thin, round guardrails in here too, a staple of both games. As a PC exclusive for a time, F.E.A.R also got to show off its high-resolution textures from time to time. Well, they were a big deal back then anyway. Throughout the game, you get little opportunities to gawk at promotional posters that aren't chunky garbage, and then read handwritten schedules and notes. F.E.A.R features some destructible barriers and objects, but where the violence to inanimate things shines is in the parallax mapping of wall damage. Chunks of the environment will look like they are blown out in a firefight, but it's a then new trick. It's just an elaborate texture without any actual deformed geometry, something that would have been difficult for contemporary processors and video cards to handle. With the game's visual emphasis on the scene within a short throw of your character, it's understandable that it's not great at portraying far-off terrain in an era before high poly counts, elaborate skyboxes, and highly detailed open worlds. Helicopter rides are cinematic, but staring out a bit too far towards the skylines is a little less so. There's probably a big reason why you travel over so much water. The city in the distance looks like 1997 Simcopter in comparison. And then we get to the physics, a feature set that was still blooming in F.E.A.R's time, leading to some cadavers that are just as capable of animating awkwardly as any other game. You have to remember, F.E.A.R was on store shelves just a few years after Ragdoll and Corpses made their mainstream debut thanks to Havoc middleware. But F.E.A.R does stuff with physics I didn't expect from games at the time. In my review for Deus Ex Human Revolution, I wondered why they would fill the world with so much detail if they weren't going to let you interact with it. It's an observation that could be made for the very sequels of this game too. Well, F.E.A.R demonstrates why. Letting them sit statically on their virtual shelves opens the possibility of them conspiring to create a massive technical catastrophe. Step on things, roll over them, or do nothing with them at all. There's so much physics jiggling and vibrating in here at times that it sounds like the apocalypse is about to tee off. It truly becomes a horror element all its own. One example came in Perseus Mandate, where a bunch of gas tanks sitting on a series of shelves will just start clattering chaotically with minimal input. But once you get used to how innovative and fresh F.E.A.R was technically, or don't really care because the game is so old at this point, the metaphorical sheen starts to wear off. Not the literal sheen, that always seems to be poking you in the eye in this era of shiny, plastic-looking textures everywhere all the time. No, I'm referring to F.E.A.R's art direction, which on the whole is just boring. As the game kicks off, you get a taste for its cinematic chops. Its visual minimalism matches what the game was capable of technically, in-engine, in real time back then. It's intimate. It carefully uses a black and white palette. There's great blocking, and most importantly, it's to the point. It effectively frames Fettel's brutality and the horror of the connection he and Point Man share, even if it's relatively arbitrary and doesn't amount to much story-wise. Inversely, by leaning on real-time cinematics, the game can't really describe the shape and motivation of a formidable army of clone soldiers outside of the fact that you have to mow down a whole hell of a lot of them. But once you're in-game, things feel less imaginative. F.E.A.R and Doom 3 are different games in different genres thematically, despite their technical similarities. But its game was extremely proud of how cool looking their horror shooter vision was. Launching a year later, F.E.A.R feels less inclined to make such a statement. Its world is populated with generic enemies and generic environments, punctuated by some kinda creepy shit. Offices look like offices, but not in a way that entices you to enjoy the setting. Industrial zones are boring, making their tedious layouts that much more difficult to push through. You shoot dudes who look like standard military combatants. Even when you're battling heavies and those drone things, it's like, really? This is all their imagination could loan them? Where the game truly demonstrates some artistic flair visually is in its most dated elements, because despite releasing in 2005, this game has a severe case of Y2K-itis. The entire interface is draped in graphical design tropes of the era, like geometric techno fonts that were popular in just about everything, like EDM album covers. Then there are the persistent lens flares, even when there's no light source to feasibly generate them. Of course, the most common elements are the bullet ripples from your slow-mo escapades and explosive detonations that mimic the Matrix. All this really needs are some enemies in leather dusters, but I think Deus Ex stole all those. The sound design, however, is unimpeachable and maybe the most artistically impressive component of the game. The acoustics of the firearms and the combat overall are incredible. Heavies groan when they die, signaling that your extended duel with them is over. Enemies scream as they perish, and their anguish is modified in slow-mo. This may have been copied to death in the past 20 years, but in 2005, this was pretty amazing. The music, it maintains suspense, but its loops aren't very interesting. It just seems to take space in the most serviceable way possible, honestly. Okay, now it's time to dive into the fun part. People may enjoy the game's horror and Alma's antagonism, but running around and shooting dudes is the reason why F.E.A.R didn't just disappear beneath the waves when it came out. I mean, it's not like the series was some big seller anyway. Combat in F.E.A.R is visceral. You're ducking behind cover, hoping it's good enough to not get shot at. You're watching not just where the enemies are, but where they can be, because they can find cover and navigate levels nearly as well as you can. Shooting enemies feels like a severe act of violence. Bullet hits and especially headshots feel like they work immediately. Enemies don't feel spongy and damage feels substantial. By agreeing to the terms of each act of violence, every effective burst of gunfire becomes a death sentence for any virtual entity who happens to be on the other end. Killing dudes just feels good here. It's a direct connection, a specific form of violent communication. This game features plenty of artifacts that accompany a shooter of its vintage. In a time before left trigger, right trigger shooter action, the shift key gives you a 2x zoom or a distant zoom with scoped weapons. As someone who grew up with PC shooters in the 90s, this feels like a missing link in shooter evolution. You'll find no better example of this quality of life change than the very sequels to this game. But playing on PC, you may honestly not even care that much because of the precision that a mouse gives you. On the other hand, playing on PC meant I kept accidentally hitting the T key when trying to reload my gun. I know I could just rebind the key, but The first F.E.A.R also features the ability to lean, which is how developers decided to advantage players in an era before snap to cover. You approach a corner and lean around it. It's a subtle effect, almost like Pointland is pivoting in 3D space around his abdomen, but it works sometimes when you need just a little bit of an edge. There are plenty of explosives you can toss or blow up, leaving you with a satisfying ringing ear effect that lingers for a bit if you're too close. By the sound of it alone, Pointman has a really kludgy walk, like he's clumsily using 3 or 4 legs to move around. Speaking of which, there is close quarters melee combat, including some special moves detailed by combos in the splash screens. It seems like melee was supposed to be a lot more ambitious and used far more often than I ever actually did. But when push came to literal shove, the butt of whatever weapon I was using worked good enough. The game does serve up some fun softballs from time to time in the form of turret sequences when you've already spent a ton of energy and ammo blowing them up inside Armacam. Here you get to mow down tons of anonymous military dudes. Watch out though, you'll be knocked out quickly if you're not keeping tabs on every angle enemies can arrive from. Throughout F.E.A.R's levels, you'll find plenty of pickups. You can stash away up to 10 medkits, which I actually did at a point, and pick up additional armor since it was that era of video gaming too. You'll also find glowing items that permanently bolster your health and slow-mo meters. The tools of your trade are your guns, and lucky for us, they are really hefty and effective. You can only carry 3 at a time, learning from Halo, it seems, which necessitates a rotation of weapons as you run out of ammo for your current blasters and stumble upon some new tools. It's a natural feeling progression. There are your standard military boom boomers and burst mode rifles, but then there are more sci-fi themed guns, like this laser rifle thing that turns enemies into skeletons. My favorite gun is the high caliber penetrator that also pins enemies to walls with the satisfaction of Painkiller's stake gun. There are like 3 sniper rifles for some reason, but the Death Ray is the best one. The shotgun, the table upon which most violent video game feasts are served, is fine, but in its ideal environment, that is, up close and personal, it is a literal blast to explode people into chunky marinara. It's actually one of the few times that enemies will explode or jib in this game, as their bodies usually retain their full rigidity in death regardless of what you do to them. Oh, how incredible a Soldier of Fortune-esque body damage system would have worked in here. There are dual pistols, but like all video game pistols, fuck 'em. Grenades are your typical affair with several types that dole out specific damage depending on whether your foes are biological or mechanical. It's paint by number stuff here. As we already know, F.E.A.R's combat is augmented by the game's well-known association with slow motion shenanigans. I've splashed about this already, but tapping that button and watching the screen go super sharp as your enemies get murked in an avalanche of ammunition and rippling geometry is really cool. It's so cool that you'll forgive so much about how much stupid stuff the game puts you through just because you can enter a room and convert a squad of bad guys into inanimate objects in one of the coolest ways possible. But uniting all these combat components is the game's legendary goal-oriented artificial intelligence. The enemies you encounter aren't interested in sitting still. Once they're aware of your presence, they'll take full advantage of the environment to take you out. Yeah, they can occasionally stick behind a single point of cover, requiring you to flush them out, but they'll demonstrate all kinds of fun behavior, like jumping through windows dramatically to get in or out of your way. Their radio chatter is constant and interesting rather than just noise, conveying real information like body counts, orders between soldiers, and tactics into the open air. Each encounter feels tactical, like a fencing match of give and take, of weighing options and making choices. Sometimes they feel like puzzles to solve. You have to pay attention to what's going on and keep moving, preventing you from camping in place, which, isn't a thing that I do. Definitely not. Enabling the AI to shine are this first game's braid-like arenas that allow you and your opponents to encircle each other in levels designed to grids in 45 and 90 degree angles. F.E.A.R's combat chemistry works because all of these components are precisely measured. It's not that the AI is so complex that it can't be replicated over 2 decades later, it's that the levels were of a certain design, and the weapons were of a certain weight, action, and feedback, that it creates a unique friction. It's this friction that encourages the player to overcome what the game throws at you, something subsequent games have a tougher time with as that chemistry changes alongside gamer expectations of a shooter. Smoke from explosions can effectively obfuscate what's going on, creating a pause in the action and making shooting into the unknown in hopes of hitting someone kinda feel badass. Since nothing can ever be perfect, enemies have a habit of spotting you as soon as a hit scan can be drawn between your model and theirs. Even if the high contrast lighting and vastly underlit levels gave the impression that you might have some stealth options, you don't have them. Enemies will have no issue striking at you when you're not even aware that they're there. Oh, and did I mention how much I hated the game's flying drones, which are clearly the cliff racers of F.E.A.R? Of course I did. They're so crappy that at least once they clipped through the door and killed me. And then there are the supernatural enemies, blah 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 blah. But while the game's intricate, even claustrophobic levels permit F.E.A.R's combat chemistry to work so effectively, they're also the game's biggest curse. In an era before walking simulators became recognized derisively as pretentious wastes of time, this game is a hecking walking simulator. There is a lot of downtime between enemy encounters, which is an interesting thing to say for a game that's an action shooter at its core. It punctuates the time you're not outmaneuvering generic military dudes with, well, a lot of nothing. But it's this downtime where the game's horror ambitions can fumigate with hallucinations, jump scares, and other flash-in-the-pan horror bits that are the horror tropey candy corn of the series. The first game in particular feels like a horror attraction at times, not all that different than Max Payne 2's Address Unknown theme park, minus any of the fun and lacking much in the way of context or meaning, or character, or interesting props or sequences of illuminating backstory with clever writing that doesn't matter. Instead, you do get stuff like disintegrated people. Lots of them. Random Alma sightings, of course. Here's some flickering lights, because those are freaky. Falling ceiling tiles are definitely scary in real life, so obviously they're scary in a video game. What about when there's blood dripping from ceiling tiles? That's bad. I'd put a maintenance ticket in for that. Or what about bones falling from a hole in the ceiling? That doesn't seem great either. The game isn't entirely cheap in arbitrary thrills though. F.E.A.R scenes of hallucination serve as a pillar of its storytelling, providing exposition, detailing what characters are doing or are motivated by, or they're just hallucinations. Downtime in a video game is just fine and dandy, but there's another big problem with F.E.A.R as a walking simulator. These levels are so fucking boring and tedious. I mean, what happens when you have fun combat, but a pretty weak story to justify each new encounter, or why you're fighting to begin with? It's an age-old question for game designers. I invented a fun new mechanic, what the hell do I do with it? In my Max Payne series review, I talk about how the second game is burdened by a tedious warehouse tour, but that eventually ended. It would be something to celebrate if it wasn't capped with an awful sniper section. F.E.A.R's answer is to send you through seemingly endless locations that start fine enough, but then feel like they're little more than padding so the game doesn't end in an hour and a half. There are big swaths of this game amidst painted over cinder blocks that feel like filler. There's a reason why some shooters stick to multiplayer, because killing randos can justify your murdering mechanics far easier and cheaper than any authored campaign can. Armacam's headquarters is the setting of the game's middle third, or what feels like the game's middle 30 hours. It starts out exciting enough as you arrive by helicopter on rooftop for a dramatic fight, but then you're tasked with wandering through an incredibly unrealistic amount of maintenance sections before reaching the office cubicles nested within. If the game had presented an open cubicle farm, that'd be one thing, maybe even exciting, but F.E.A.R breaks up the office space for the sake of gameplay. You're going to see so much Armacam promotional material and swag in this building, which work well to sell you on how hardcore these guys are about being participants in the American military-industrial complex. It's nuts, but not quite as nuts as the completely illogical layout of what's supposed to be a building that hundreds of people work in. The design of these levels, despite being almost entirely linear with some down and back spurs, feels like it borrows from the chaotic randomness of Citadel Station. Because of the illogical layout of the facilities you fight through, it's easy to get lost, because the game also neglects to include much in the way of landmarks or points of orientation. This carries into the expansions too. As you play through these levels, you wonder why any rational company or community would design and build out so many illogical spaces. Cities aren't built like this. Corporate headquarters aren't built like this. You're genuinely not going to remember much of anything about these settings except for these sections toward the end where Armacam trucks are zooming after you down tight alleyways. I definitely remember those. F.E.A.R. also borrows plenty of tropes from early 3D shooters, like warehouses full of crates, ladders that are clunky to climb, sewer levels, easy electrical hazard puzzles, grates, vents, and vending machines. There are some interesting demonstrations of detail from time to time, like in some of the complex machinery you encounter. It's not as showy or interesting as the stuff that lines the corridors of Doom 3, but there's really not much in the way of flourish or fun here anyway. It's painted cinderblock walls as far as the eye can see. This is a city without people, and yet it features plenty of the places they would probably live and work, like never-ending warehouse districts, industrial districts, office buildings, a decrepit apartment complex, on, punctured by bloody violence. This makes for an extremely lonely experience where nearly all of the humans you encounter are the ones you're also tasked with murdering. Your F.E.A.R. coworkers are a rare sight, and anyone else tasked with fighting with you tend to be evaporated on a whim by Alma. And then there's that one guy with the weird face that you meet in the heart of Armacam's corporate headquarters, Mapes, who tasks you with some stuff before ultimately revealing that he's a trash human. Oh, his final moments are exciting. But here's the thing. Even with the boring levels to wander through, the boring enemies to defeat, and the boring story that barely seems to exist, F.E.A.R. works well because the combat works so well. I mean, watching the game is a slog, but playing it, you are engaged. Even as the levels go overlong and you just want the stupid game to end sometimes, you're still anticipating the next encounter. You know that once you hear the radio squawks or the whirring of helicopter blades, you're about to engage in some real-time chess, and you'll need to take inventory of the environment around you to maintain an advantage. Time disappears when you're discharging ammunition, but it tends to chug when you're not. The Stanley Parable taught us that mundane office environments could be fun to navigate and explore, even without their embellishments, so it doesn't seem like much of a leap that Armacam's could too. But that's not what happened. Who really wants to be dumped into a corporate headquarters and spend half your time navigating its oversized and cruel maintenance levels? I can't imagine it's some large number of people. It's slight, but the game does incentivize some exploration by hiding medkits and stat boosters in corners just off the beaten path. It makes these spaces feel slightly naturalistic, and even contemporary even 20 years later. F.E.A.R. sets up quite a bit narratively that doesn't pay off, but with how low of a priority storytelling is in this game, you'd be forgiven if you got to the end, felt unfulfilled, and then didn't really care. If this had been the only F.E.A.R. game, it probably would have been better for everyone. But this was not the end of F.E.A.R., oh no, and the franchise will certainly test your patience from here on out. Hey, this would be a great time to mention that while I don't make 1 billion videos a year, YouTube doesn't seem to be providing you, my subscribers, with an easy ability to keep track of what I'm up to. So, while you should definitely like and subscribe and hit the bell and all that other crap, you should also sign up to become a free member of the Nth Review Patreon. There, I make sure you get updates on upcoming projects and releases, especially when YouTube won't keep you up to date. If you do decide to support the channel financially, you get in the end video listings, you get access to periodic members-only FAQs, and special Discord channels as well. Check it out at patreon.com/The Nth Review.
Looks like we're all still alive.
Small favors. I can't reach anybody on the radio. Something's blocking the signal.
F.E.A.R. wound up being a pretty big success for a shooter that debuted as a PC exclusive. Naturally, this easily justified a path towards sequels and the establishment of a franchise because of the big green you-know-what. But things got complicated pretty fast thanks to some transactional realities that burdened what the franchise could and couldn't do for the rest of its days. And it doesn't start easy either. For F.E.A.R, developer Monolith's contract with publisher Vivendi under the Sierra nameplate stipulated that Monolith retained the rights to the story and characters within the game, while Vivendi retained the name F.E.A.R for future titles. During development of the first game, Monolith was acquired by Warner Bros. Games, which effectively separated F.E.A.R's intellectual property from the recognizable title that they built with audiences. And at this point playing the series, it might seem that Vivendi got the better deal. They could make F.E.A.R 2, and provided it wasn't trash, it could be a huge sales success because people would be looking for the title with a 2 at the end. Who actually cares about Alma and Armacam and all that, right? Monolith could still make a F.E.A.R 2, but it couldn't legally be called F.E.A.R 2. But before Vivendi would lose access to Alma and all that stuff, they retained the ability to build out the F.E.A.R brand via ports and expansions of that first game. I couldn't hash out some of the details of this mess, like how many expansions Vivendi could make, or why they didn't contract Monolith to make them before they headed off in their own direction. Instead, they contracted Day One Studios, a developer best known for their MechAssault games for Microsoft on the original Xbox, to port F.E.A.R to consoles. The Xbox 360 port would land on store shelves a year and a half after the PC debut, while the PlayStation 3 SKU would arrive in April 2007, nearly 2 years after. Critics seem to think that the Xbox 360 version was decent, but the PS3 port wasn't just incredibly late, it didn't run well either. Vivendi's next priority was crafting expansions to F.E.A.R that built on the lore of that game. They contracted studio Timegate to craft a pair of expansions quickly and cheaply. The first, Extraction Point, debuted only a year after F.E.A.R. The second, Perseus Mandate, debuted only a year after that. These expansions would be sold together on console as a standalone F.E.A.R Files release because, value. If you're already feeling a little jittery about how these expansions wound up with these kinds of penny and clock pinching restrictions, your fears will be justified very quickly. To put it bluntly, both of these expansions are bad. Like, forget they exist bad, which is why I'm going to spend so much time talking about them here. Timegate's first expansion to F.E.A.R, Extraction Point, recaps the epilogue of the original game as you're flying away from the detonation of the Project Origin site on a helicopter. Alma appears and you crash into a neighborhood, the second time that this happens within just a few short hours in this lore. This time, your F.E.A.R colleague Jin and hanger-on Holiday don't just survive the crash, they do so with seemingly no injuries this time. After some brief tutorialization, you stumble upon the replica soldiers that were deactivated by the death of your brother, F.E.A.R at the end of the first game. They're still standing, but with heads knocked over with nothing to motivate them. It makes you wonder if F.E.A.R has to consciously tell them to eat or poop too. You'd think that for just a moment that this would prompt the expansion to do something clever with what enemies they serve up, but that's not what happens. Instead, the game arbitrarily decides to resurrect F.E.A.R to reclaim and reactivate his soldiers with a rationale that is so flimsy that even the writers couldn't get it to work. Mapes is also still alive somehow for similarly flimsy reasons. And then after fighting a resurrected F.E.A.R, there's this very interesting sequence where a hole is carved out of a church floor from prismatic elements which both awkwardly mimics Minecraft and looks awful. This expansion wastes absolutely no time in making you feel like this is some terrible, low-rent nightmare version of the story of F.E.A.R, and that what you're getting here is not going to match any lowered expectations you may have had. The goal of Extraction Point, with its even wispier story than the base game, is to reconnect with Jin at the hospital after the Project Origin Vault disaster. Lacking any other major objectives, this campaign, not only fails to create even the slightest sense of momentum or progress, but it feels incredibly enabled to murder both Jin and Holiday in the most gruesome ways. These events don't really feel like the conclusion of some kind of tension or the turning point of your relationship with these characters, because neither the base game nor this expansion really established those to begin with. No, they just feel like, here were these things that you had, and now you don't have them anymore. Jin seemed pretty bored about being in the game anyway. Maybe she was just trying to quit the expansion before you do.
Oh god, they're dead. They're all dead.
You'll also find Alma dancing around you, fluttering around like a deflating balloon over the course of the campaign. She arbitrarily kills people, she can kill you at any point, and then she doesn't. It feels wrong and arbitrary, which is true of the entire series. Okay, so now it's the end of 2007. Timegate has stepped up to the bat for its second swing in expanding the F.E.A.R universe with Perseus Mandate. It's a piece of content that screams of last-minute desperation to manifest as many of their interesting ideas as possible before time ran out. Rather than continuing on from Extraction Point, Perseus Mandate tries something different by being a sidequel that runs parallel to the end of the base game and then their first expansion. Here you slip into the boots of a super soldier in a second F.E.A.R unit. There's a bit of a logic gap here because you somehow have Point Man's special slow-mo skills despite not being Point Man. Is Point Man not that special despite being a son of Alma? Or do members of the F.E.A.R unit take some special pills to be able to zoom around like you can in these games? Perseus Mandate starts so much stronger than Extraction Point with more action-oriented set pieces that evoke other popular shooters of the era, like Call of Duty. But get about 90 minutes in and that vibe starts to fall off precipitously. In fact, the whole expansion, slightly more than the first one, feels like a community theater production of the base game with even fewer assets on the ground than that game, which debuted 2 years earlier. Perseus Mandate does have some other wins though. For the first time in the series, it has native widescreen support so you don't have to patch it in. It also features AI you can fight alongside, something this expansion plays up in the opening moments with your F.E.A.R teammates. Extraction Point tries this with some smoke and mirrors during the moments you're working with Holiday, but it's here that you actually feel like you're part of a squad. It's a very lonely experience otherwise. This second expansion also plays with more diverse settings and set pieces, perhaps the most diverse group of levels tied to the original game. It doesn't always work, but the attempt is mighty and admirable. One of my favorite sequences in any of these games is a desperate fight with a high-powered enemy mech involving a chase around Armacam's basement labs. Yeah, it's still in an office building, but I'll take it. Something I only lightly dabbled in for the sake of completionism is a special speedrun mode included in here. Your goal is to reach the end of one of a few specially designed levels based on the assets of the campaign, while dodging or knocking out enemies along the way. It feels a lot like something assembled from spare parts, and I don't think it was particularly fun, but I'm so glad they tried it. With some tweaks and some kind of score-based combo meter, it could have consumed a lot of my time. Vivendi's expansions for F.E.A.R fall flat for the same reason that all expansions of this era do. They're low budget, dehydrated, and abbreviated extensions of the base game. I talk about this phenomenon in my Red Faction series review, which were another set of games that were augmented by middling expansions. In that time, expectations for these extra sleeves of content were typically pretty low anyway, and yet they still seemed to barely meet the bar. Expansions had been successful and popular on the PC for many years before these games were released. But it would be a while before they felt substantial on consoles, where they became known more specifically as downloadable content. More ambitious DLC, but DLC nonetheless. Before I get to the root of the issues I and definitely other people have with these expansions, I want to be absolutely clear that being built on the mechanics of the original game, there are still interesting and fun moments here from time to time. Typically, maybe 51% of the time, these expansions are entirely serviceable moment to moment and don't have you checking your watch or pinging howlongtobeat.com for how long you probably have left in these adventures. There are times where I went, wow, that's cool, before I'd be tasked with slogging through a meaningless maze of a level until I reached the next one of these moments. The lows of these expansions are so low that they tend to retroactively annihilate what enjoyment you may get out of them. If I weren't playing these in their entirety for this review, I would have absolutely given up on them, or, as was the case here, not play them at all until I commanded myself to. The sins of the expansions mirror the sins of the base game, but they still find ways to end up worse because of tweaks that they make to the formula, thanks in what large part seems to be a lack of resources. Of course, carrying on from the base game, these expansions are also vastly superior to play moment to moment than to watch footage of. The plot of either game is still essentially just yanking you from destination to destination, scare to scare. The base game at least has the structure and budget to dress it up and keep you entertained, however thin that story wound up being. There's still plenty of blood and very little horror in either of these expansions. These set pieces don't weave together at all to form sturdy narrative elements because of the lack of any substantial story beats. The smaller horrors and clearly recycled cinematic bits these expansions present still only exist to drive you to the next shooting dude's encounter. Lacking much in the way of story, they employ Fettle to infrequently taunt you and drop exposition, but these teases are so inconsequential and vague that they could be delivered in any order, possibly across either title, and it wouldn't matter much in the slightest. Even the voicemails in these campaigns, typically leadened with exposition, are practically meaningless here because they're just line deliveries to set the mood. Hallucinations were the centerpiece of F.E.A.R's horror, and they return here to serve the same purpose. Often they feel like being handed a 12-pack, only discover that half are missing, but there are some interesting experiments within. In one segment of Extraction Point, the walls push away like the Shodan reveal of System Shock 2. It doesn't look the greatest, especially when you consider that this came out most of a decade later, but it's one of the most imaginative sequences in there. In another section toward the end, you wind up in a supernatural asylum. As you touch a supernatural thingy in one cell, the door behind you seals shut, and the walls slowly start to shrink around you. It's simple, but it's incredibly effective. The expansions take one of my biggest issues with F.E.A.R's combat, namely the gallery of generic burly dude soldier enemies, and tries to mix it up. Unfortunately, their solution wasn't actually a better one. Sure, you'll have 3 soldiers to blow up instead of 4, but the ranks have been replaced with annoying supernatural foes. Do you like invisible enemies? Because they're here. More of those floating dudes who emerge from black holes? Covered. Perseus Mandate leans even harder into this with the most annoying enemy in the entire series, the trap monsters that stop you cold and require you to shoot down at them. You can usually dodge their wispy, telltale deployments, but sometimes they'll be waiting in a dark hallway and catch you by surprise. There are also some fun new tools to blow people up with though. A grenade launcher makes for explosive fun. A laser doesn't just let you fry up baddies, it survives these expansions too. There's a minigun for vibes and a lightning gun for insta-kills too. My favorite addition, however, which neither expansion gives you enough time with, are the personal turrets. Plant these like proximity mines and you'll have some automatic helpers for some good fights. Be careful with these though, you can't scoop them back up if you haphazardly toss one somewhere. But these expansions have a lot of issues, but Timegate's greatest sin was meddling with the formula that made F.E.A.R's combat and subsequently F.E.A.R as a whole work so well. So well, I'll reiterate, that you could forgive nearly everything else about the game because of how good shooting dudes is. So why did they do it? Why meddle with a good thing? Well, in the wake of the first game's success, gamers complained about its claustrophobic levels and confined combat arenas. On its face, this is justified. Those levels were claustrophobic and constrictive. They never truly let you out into the open, instead yanking you along a lot of tedious hallways and obvious gameplay funnels. In response, Timegate decided to build bigger and more open levels. Upon first encounter, and several afterward, this creates some new, interesting, and even fun encounters that just weren't possible in the base game. This also allowed Timegate to craft some interesting combat settings, like this street fight, or this Half-Life 2-esque nighttime rail yard battle. But if you go back to why F.E.A.R's combat works so well, it's because all of its elements were carefully calibrated to work together in concert to create friction. It's immediate and intense, like an itch you need to scratch. Yeah, shooting dudes is common in games, but few create this kind of palpable tension by simply putting you in an environment with a gun against bad guys. In moving away from the braid-like arenas of the base game, these expansions diffuse that tension. The combat still works, but it doesn't work as well. It doesn't bring the signature punch that the base game was known for because every other element that F.E.A.R was built on, including its goal-oriented AI, can't work with it as well. As a result, combat feels less tactical, less faceted, and less interesting. Encounters in these time-gate adventures often boil down to being on the far end of a long, large space from an enemy and simply strafing between points of cover. It's a problem I highlight in Max Payne 3, where the more adventurous gunplay of the Remedy games is disadvantaged because of level design and snap to cover. It's easier to duck out from behind cover to take your shots and whittle away enemies' health, but it's a bit less fun. Have you checked out my Max Payne trilogy review? I mean, I'd recommend it. Perhaps Timegate recognized this trade-off because these expansions provide plenty of excuses to deploy more heavies and mech units as a challenge instead. They even invent a super mech to make sure you're feeling that combat tension in another way. But then there are all the parts of these expansions where you're not in combat that will try your patience in ways that only shooters of that era could, something that wound up being a weak point to the first game too. You'll find that time gates restrictions made these inter-combat sequences less enticing too. These levels are linear and lacking much in the way of props and world-filling details compared to the base game. Often, they barely feel beyond first draft gray boxing, as if assembled in haste. That church level early on in Extraction Point, the one with the Minecraft chunks, has you wandering through an immensely long series of administrative offices. It's like walking through the fever dream version of a place you've been before that keeps looping nonsensically, and it doesn't seem to ever end. Perseus Mandate deploys you to another set of Armacam offices that feel larger and labyrinthine than your tour in F.E.A.R, but these feel less detailed and more spare as a result. It signals a lack of polish that, once more, seems to be based on production limitations. In fact, both expansions have you revisit locations from the original game that are vaguely familiar but don't include any of the actual geometry from your first visit, as though you're visiting another wing of the same place. Specifically, the conclusion of Perseus Mandate has you chasing an evil dude into the depths of the Project Origin base, a kit-bashed variant of that level you originally fought through in the base game with some moody Doom 3-esque aesthetics. The evil dude's about 5 minutes ahead of you in pursuit of a MacGuffin, Fettel's genetic material or whatever, but the pursuit seems to continue endlessly, with lab modules being added one after the other for no other reason than preventing the game from ending. Wandering through the subway level in either of these expansions is evocative of the first Max Payne and all the incredible memories that came along with it, but it was a firm reminder that the subway worked there because it was such a tight series of encounters. Here, it's just a fucking mess, and you do it in both expansions with you headed down into it in Extraction Point and coming back from it in Perseus Mandate. This revelation felt like little more than a deja vu moment when I played through them, with the payoff not clicking for me until I went back through the footage. But then the subways were such a burden to play through that it felt like that was the least they could have done. Oh yeah, and how often did I wander lost in either of these games, despite how relatively simple they are? Setting aside what really feels like an exasperating amount of filler content and needless extensions of those environments for the sake of playtime, what really makes these expansions so difficult to work through is a vague sense of plausibility. And I know what you're thinking, this is a video game. Plausibility? Realism? That's what we're complaining about? I hear you. The problem comes from a combination of Time Gate's more linear and plainly decorated levels that don't even hint at sections you can't access. There's no sense that there's a beyond these spaces. This is something that the base game got around by having tighter, more coiled levels that you would play through one way and then work backward through from another floor. Time Gate presents linear levels that are supposed to represent real working spaces, but as you move through them, they don't present a church or a hospital or even a secret lab that would ever exist, because it would make no sense to anyone who worked there, or to anyone who's ever been in one. It truly makes these expansions feel like work, content for the sake of content, and Time Gate's tweaked combat formula can't adequately compensate for this. In fact, often it makes them worse. Even though you eventually accomplish things in these expansions and trigger cutscenes at points, nothing has any weight and everything seems a bit wrong. Even seeing the exploding walls at the end of Extraction Point where multiple forms of Alma merge feels like the conclusion of an amateur mod. It also doesn't make much sense. There are also some weird miscellaneous things that emerged while playing these expansions. In getting them to run on PC, I encountered weird crashes between levels in both expansions where it would say I had been disconnected from the server even though I wasn't connected to one. As I understand it, client-server level architecture is pretty important in shooters, something that John Romero talks about in his book, Doom Guy. One between level load just crashed the game entirely. I'm not sure if this is how the game played originally. I also had to install a DLL I found on the internet because the frame rate in Extraction Point was crap and it was somehow related to my Logitech mouse and something to do with DirectX or whatever. Once I figured that out, it ran decently. And then there's the blatant Dell XPS computer placement. It's something that proudly pops up as an advertisement in the opening logo parade, but it manifests in the game by taking up space on tons of random offices in both laptop and desktop formats with their dated mid-aughts industrial design. You can't even deface their logos with firepower or lasers. My good pal Orzine had one of these around this time, and they used a proprietary power cord that made the whole thing useless when he forgot it in another state. So much of my time with these expansions consisted of silently pleading for them to just be over, to just be finished, for the next boss encounter to be the last one of the chapter, for the next chapter to be the last one, so that the nightmares would just end. Writing this review, there's a joy that flickers up in my heart when I imagine another timeline where both of these were half their length with far more interesting content. You've probably noticed that I haven't really spilled much on what actually happens in these expansions, despite having more game time in these combined than I did the original game. The actual reason why is because despite Monolith's initial blessing of the direction Timegate was taking the F.E.A.R story, everything that happens in here winds up becoming void canonically as a result of the corporate stuff that was happening alongside these releases. Decanonized, it's easy to see why these expansions immediately became apocryphal. Timegate's last minutes with the player come in a post-credit sequence at the end of Perseus Mandate. It feels like it was written in 30 seconds, but it's supposed to hint at something more for the genetic material that you spend the last act of the campaign trying to acquire. Watching it, I realized that it was rendered invalid too. F.E.A.R's Vivendi timeline, an invention born purely of corporate bullshittery, not all that dissimilar to Star Trek's cinematic Kelvin universe, would soon find itself 6 feet under, obsolete.
Dealing with pissed off dead chicks is a little outside my area of expertise.
Let's focus on finding Snake Fist.
Watching F.E.A.R's corporate divergence and the titles that came about as a result, it's not hard to feel that Vivendi was peeking over Monolith's shoulder and trying to copy their homework. While Vivendi was cashing in on the assets and reputation of the original game while not providing much original effort on their own, Monolith was busy working on their own thing, a game that would wind up being both a canonical and spiritual successor to the original F.E.A.R. Remember, Warner's and Monolith held the rights to the F.E.A.R storyline and characters, but not the actual F.E.A.R name, which belonged to Vivendi. This meant that Monolith's F.E.A.R sequel needed a new title. With the help of fans, their game became Project Origin, named after the Armacam project that harnessed Alma Wade's psionic energy for absolute terror and profit. Vivendi struck out trying to make F.E.A.R games, as I just spent a whole bunch of time talking about, and in a much larger corporate thingy, their game unit was merged with Activision to become Activision Blizzard. As a result, Warner's was able to buy the F.E.A.R name back from them in September 2008, reuniting the brain and its name. Project Origin could then officially become F.E.A.R 2, with Monolith opting to keep Project Origin as its subtitle. This was now the final nail in the coffin for Vivendi's short-lived F.E.A.R-niverse, which officially became decanonized. There's one more project in the Vivendi pool that I'll talk about, but in the next chapter. Ironically, the F.E.A.R name became a casualty of all this corporate malarkey. With only 5 months between Warner's reacquiring the nameplate and F.E.A.R 2's February 2009 release, it would have been far too tall an ask to try and reintegrate the F.E.A.R team back into its storyline. Its story content would have been locked down by then, with the team scouring to find and fix bugs. As a result, you'll find a lack of references to F.E.A.R or the First Encounter Assault Recon Unit in this game at all, or even the third game that follows, so that Monolith could distance themselves from Vivendi's efforts. In fact, F.E.A.R 2's protagonist is a soldier in a new non-F.E.A.R Special Forces squad. With the F.E.A.R unit having been scrubbed from the narrative of Monolith's sequel out of necessity, the F.E.A.R name that Warner's bought was now little more than a consumer comfort. It was little more than a signal to gamers that this was, in fact, a sequel to that one game they bought at some point and enjoyed. I don't know. That seems kind of sad to me. In sharp contrast to the cheap hand-me-down tools, assets, and production values of the expansions, F.E.A.R 2 feels dramatically different and fresh, like upgrading your phone after a decade. This is clearly a very new game with a budget to accomplish its goals, and a lot of technical prowess to try new things. Side by side, the delta between this game and the original is vast, a bit of a shock considering these are both Monolith games. It reminds me of the contrast between Red Faction and its Soviet-themed sequel. Like the first game, F.E.A.R 2 revels in being cinematic. With the power of its substantially more impressive technology, the cutscenes here aren't just more interesting, they don't just convey more information, they get new angles, a new scope of capabilities, and a lot of new creative energy. Principally, F.E.A.R 2 sheds the high-contrast Doom 3 but if Tom Clancy vibe of the first game, adopting a brighter, more colorful art direction. It's powered by a new technical fidelity that trickles down into everything the game does visually. It's an exciting, huge step up. Instead of being a horror-tinged military shooter in dark urban environments, F.E.A.R 2 embraces more science fiction theming in its weapons and levels. But it goes in other directions boldly too. Here, Alma is regularly featured in Golden Dream sequences swinging from a tree on a hill, something the original game wouldn't have had the vocabulary to produce. Enemies now glow when you enter slow-mo, eliminating any kind of confusion about where to point your gun and click it. Monolith also produced some quirky and fun cartoons for Armacam's young students who were unknowingly participating in Project Paragon. In the same way that the first game seemed to borrow Y2K era aesthetic tropes, this sequel feels like a game of the mid-aughts. This comes immediately with the game's heavy and deep use of the font Agency. There's even a GameSpy plug in the opening logo parade because the game used their multiplayer service on PC. Remember GameSpy? What do you mean no? There are also annoying and period-fashionable reticles over items in the environment to ensure you see them. This is at odds with the more diegetic approach that they used in the first game, where, well, if you didn't see them, you didn't see them. These are a little classier than the reticles in Red Faction Armageddon, but they still take up an annoying amount of visual real estate. The worst iteration may be the reticle with the unnecessary cruft around it during battle armor sequences. And then your moment-to-moment action UI is warp projected onto the screen like it's on the inside of a spherical visor. It's so old school. Did I mention the technical upgrades? Holy crap, these two games represent such a massive graphical leap, coming during the swing of the graphical fidelity S-curve that we experienced in the late aughts with the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. The models are higher resolution and detailed, the levels feature far more facets and shapes, more intricate lighting, and bigger budgets for props and geometry. It's still very pretty to look at over 16 years later. This game also mercifully ejects the original game's stencil shadows, but keeping up with the Joneses technologically was entirely expected. Playing on PC, I did encounter a couple of strange shader issues that clearly didn't look like Monolith's intent. They didn't distract me from playing or completing the game, except in the final moments where flames were replaced with squares. That was kind of funny. They look weird, but over the course of the game, they actually kind of grew on me a bit, building up the mystique of the game. Beyond the upgrades and presentation, you'll notice that the game experience has been consoleized, a term that must have been absolute poison for PC fanboys who enjoyed the series when it was exclusive to their Pentium or AMD supercomputers. Monolith did not care for Day One Studios' work in porting their game to consoles, so they decided to handle the console versions for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, as well as the PC, all at once in-house. It seems that in the process, parity required making some aspects of the game across all three versions, well, the same. F.E.A.R 2 also removes leaning around corners, which, well, let's be fair, it was rarely ever that useful in the original game or the expansions. It also removes the quick save functionality that you needed to lean on in the earlier games. In its place is a far more forgiving series of checkpoints, although there are some sprints where it would have been nice to have an extra checkpoint or two. The voicemails, laptop voiceovers, and story snippets of the first game are migrated to a low-density data net screen, which makes it functional on TVs, but big and clunky on PC monitors. Watching this footage closely enough, you may notice that the textures are pretty low resolution. I had thought that maybe they had been sacrificed to maintain asset parity between the PC and the RAM-limited console versions, and for some reason didn't remember finding a texture detail slider as I probed the graphics menu. But Shgatsky set me straight during the 4-player podcast and even provided some footage to show that something was wrong with my settings. Between these adjustments in gameplay for console gamers and the complete overhaul of the art direction, F.E.A.R 2 doesn't just give me Red Faction 2 vibes, it gives me Deus Ex 2 vibes. Yeah, Invisible War. It doesn't quite feel like the full-on subversion of expectations that game is, but I just had those vibes playing this. This game truly feels like Monolith was more than happy to toss out the baby with the bathwater if need be, like they truly had no fucks to give in pursuing a new direction for the franchise, and I love that kind of courage, even if the result wasn't quite as good. With F.E.A.R 2, Monolith, like Timegate before it, sought to improve on the claustrophobic and confined levels of that first game by creating larger, more complicated levels that mix tight and open spaces organically with lots of environmental props. Not only does this create some unique levels to plow through with some epic set pieces, it also reintroduces friction to the combat formula. The technology of the era permits the game to have curved surfaces and fancy lighting, allowing them to look more like what they're supposed to look like and expanding the scope of the game's settings. It allows, for the first time in the series, for these levels to have a logical structure. It allows you to explore buildings and labs that seem like they were designed to truly work and function for fictional, virtual people, rather than being a theme for a winding linear death tour. F.E.A.R 2 creates a great first impression with its opening infiltration of a luxury apartment tower in pursuit of Armacam's embattled CEO, Genevieve Aristide. Whether you're pushing across sky bridges, investigating Aristide's penthouse, shooting through the roof-level party space, or soaking in the much higher fidelity of the new Fairport skybox, it feels so dramatically different out of the gate than the boxy grid-based layouts of neutrally colored industrial corridors and office clusters in previous entries. It allows this game to feel so much bigger, immersive, and fun. There are some interesting electrical hazard puzzles, and I wish the game would do more with them, or just feature more environmental puzzles, period. F.E.A.R 2 has some interesting and even exciting new levels that don't just tease the game's technical potential, but also challenge Monolith's imagination to expand what this series is capable of engaging. Beyond Aristide's pad, making your way through Wade Elementary with all of its well-realized decor and message boards is incredibly creative, featuring the fixtures of an actual elementary school, from the nurse's office to the cafeteria. There's a tiny round-based segment in a tactical training environment that's neat mostly because it sits in the middle of a level that's pretty bullshit otherwise. The rail sequence to reach Still Island toward the end of the game is set in another stereotypically industrial environment, but it's so dynamic, interesting, and well-paced that it doesn't feel like it runs out of fuel before it reaches its conclusion. The variety of levels here, despite the game's ups and downs in pacing and quality, is dope. But this wouldn't be an entry in the F.E.A.R series without what feels like a substantial amount of padding set in the dankest industrial and run-down urban settings. This game delivers an epic sense of whiplash between sequences that are extremely interesting and lively and others that are tedious slogs. But at least they have vents. While these levels feature a kind of internal logic, they also fall in line with the series' tendency to scale their settings to absurd dimensions. Like the opening church level of Extraction Point, Wade Elementary features the most complex layout for an elementary school I've ever seen. And that's before you find the secret entrance for the complex Armacam laboratory hiding underneath. And don't worry, getting lost in these levels is still an issue. Another subway section, OMG, PU. And then there are the MFing sniper alleys, one of the worst kind of level segments. And while the sting isn't as bad as the other F.E.A.R titles, there's still a sense that you need to rough it out between set pieces. The F.E.A.R sequels put in substantial effort to narratively backfill what in the hell was going on in the first game. Why this was even necessary is interesting to consider. Did Monolith lack the technical or artistic ability to tell a story in the first game, or was there a lack of story to begin with and it was tacked on late in development? Either way, these games seem to treat the first game like a prologue rather than a complete story that they're producing the next chapter for. Despite having a full tool set to tell more robust stories, or tell them at all, there's still not a lot of actual story here. Much of the game is still structured to guide you between flashy horror effects and people being liquefied arbitrarily. Of course, it doesn't help that the game deposits a lot of its most important information in the data net screen, but if you miss these little intel disks in the environment, you don't get that information. In F.E.A.R 2, you play not as the Point Man, but as Sergeant Michael Beckett, another silent, null protagonist that's part of a special forces group that isn't F.E.A.R, who is sent in to retrieve Armacam's CEO. Your pursuit is parallel to an increasingly militaristic Armacam, who has deployed a J.K. Simmons-looking dude and Colonel Yannick, who leads their special forces to recover their renegade CEO. In time, you discover that your squad is special, the result of Project Harbinger, Armacam's effort to produce another psychic commander like Paxton Fettel through technological means without having Alma around to produce more offspring. As a result, your squad's fate is tied to going insane and being liquefied by Alma even as they're screaming out in agony in support for her. Or whatever, I don't know. After you're lured into a special psychic antenna chamber by Aristide early on, you gain Alma's special attention, which might explain why she annihilates your largely forgettable squad mates and not you over the course of the game. There's also an anonymous tipster who injects himself into your comms channel. He helps you as you struggle to escape Armacam's deeply concealed facilities while teasing some bigger stuff to come. You eventually make contact with him to get the full details on how to defeat Alma in a meeting that's cut short rather dramatically. The game concludes with you going to blow up Alma with the help of a big psychic amplifier on Still Island at the edge of the now largely ruined city of Fairport. Aristide shows up at the last minute to try and not allow that to happen. Instead, however, you father a baby with Alma without your consent while you're strung up in the psychodrome. The threat of a third unrestrained Alma kid in her heightened, hyper-powerful supernatural form is kind of a big deal, which is a great way to cut to credits. Guess we'll need a sequel. Paxton Fettel is reborn. Again, in what I can handily say is the best piece of F.E.A.R expansionary/DLC content in the series. This nugget of playtime seems to be born out of the fact that F.E.A.R 2 decanonized Extraction Point, the narrative experiment where Timegate brought Fettel back to life because they had a budget on evil characters and he's all they could afford. Now, why did F.E.A.R 2 need to officially resurrect Fettel? Guess we'll need a sequel. Reborn takes place concurrently with the events of the base game. Not that you'd really be able to tell because it doesn't cross paths with what you do in there as Beckett. Here you play as replica clone trooper Foxtrot 813, who gets flipped by the ghost of Fettel to come down to the crater of the Project Origin explosion to resurrect him from a supernatural prison. This thing has some interesting ideas, like the fact that the in-game interface is different than the visor from the base game. It reminded me a whole lot of the faction skinning of Command & Conquer, like playing as GDI versus Nod versus Allies versus Soviets in Red Alert. It's fun then to get discreetly subconscious objectives from Fettel like obey or you must press on, you have no allies. Hand in hand with this DLC's interesting setup are some genuinely fun levels, maybe the most fun levels in the whole series. It kicks off with a battle armor sequence on a rooftop, allowing you to mow down tons of enemies right out of the gate like a badass. There's a highway section in the back half with easy access to a sniper rifle that sets up a sniper rally sequence that's actually enjoyable to play. But my favorite slice, one that's incredibly imaginative, is navigating a skyscraper that's been knocked over. The only bummer is the guess and test hazards that treat mistakes like instant deaths. These environments also gradually grow strangely more horrific and nightmarish as you go. It wouldn't be a F.E.A.R shooter if it didn't grind to a halt for an interval or two, but it also wouldn't be a shooter of the era unless it had you spend far too long shotgunning through a sewer to get between two disparate sections of a city. The impact of any less than stellar design decisions is minimized by the breezy runtime. This entire DLC only takes about 90 minutes to complete, so you're never truly stuck in the sludge for terribly long. In the end, Fettel possesses Foxtrot's body, freeing him from this prison thing he's in. In retrospect, I'm not sure why Foxtrot needs to take on such a violent campaign to murder all of his co-workers, or why Fettel needs to fight all of his former commandants, the ATC and all the other supernatural entities around the site. Why didn't Foxtrot just peace out, slide into a narrow alley, and disappear amidst the chaos surrounding the Project Origin site? Would have saved not just a lot of bullets, but the potential loss of Fettel's future body. Despite those quibbles and the last-minute battles against mechs that are just dumb, this is not only the best DLC I've played in the series, but maybe from this entire era, which I must admit is not some big number of titles. Reborn is so interesting that I wish they'd built a whole game out of the setup and concepts in here. It has a narrative hook, the creators weren't just recycling stuff from the base game, and at just an hour and a half of playtime, it doesn't overstay its welcome. I'm so close to saying that this F.E.A.R 2 is better than the original game in basically every way, in the same way that Thief 2 is nearly the best game in that series if it weren't for its lackluster final levels. But F.E.A.R 2's biggest flaw is a tarnishing of the original game's most important feature, a set of mechanics that buoyed the game against the rest of its flaws and made it legendary in the eyes of gamers who hail it as one of the best games of all time: the combat. You see, the one thing that Time Gate's expansions had going on for them is that they lifted the first game's prolific combat system straight out of that game, even if they made some tweaks that let some air out of the tires. Here, combat trades the tactical intensity of the first game for sharper moment-to-moment action. Maybe it was chasing trends, or appealing more to console gamers who were glomming onto the fast gameplay of Call of Duty, but the feel is different now, more snappy and action-oriented. Looking down sights is a big component here in a way it never was before, making the pixel-precise, no-scope aiming of the original game seem anachronistic and weird. Combat encounters happen more often in this sequel, increasing the pace of the game, but leaving you with far less downtime for the creepiness of its empty levels to seep into your head. But there's something lacking in the actual connection between your ammunition and the foes you seek to vanquish. Enemies seem more spongy, requiring you to pump more ammo into them than you anticipate, or at least more than I anticipated playing the games back to back. Augmenting this is the feeling that combat animations feel less realistic, as each bullet strikes the enemy, something made apparent in slow-mo. Here's one example, clearly visible in slow-mo, where the first strike produces the appropriate backwards reaction, but each subsequent strike forces the new cadaver toward you unrealistically, or doesn't respond to your strikes at all. Here's another example where pumping shotgun blasts into an enemy stuns them, but each subsequent blast doesn't accomplish much of anything visually except tick down an invisible health meter until they fall over dead. In the original game, not only do enemies respond more accurately to your intention, but since they're less spongy, they die with fewer hits. This gives you fewer opportunities to notice how odd their lower fidelity combat reactions are. With each individual kill here, you probably won't notice this change in the combat formula. I certainly didn't, as I leaned on weapons that doled out more damage per round. But multiplied across the dozens of enemies you'll shoot up in each interval, it eventually makes the combat feel mushy and less responsive. I don't know why they made these changes, and it's not easy to quantify except to watch footage of these two games side by side. But playing and then beating the game, I felt it. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was something there. Maybe I'm out of my mind. Drop a line in the comments telling me I'm wrong. Then like and subscribe. The higher fidelity of the levels does highlight some of the flaws of the AI though, like when it's clear that one of them is hiding or trying to hide in cover, but it's also still entirely visible to the player. The first game could dance around this by providing solid walls and barriers for cover. The illusion is a bit less complete here. The enemy mix retreats to boring, but it's still a better outcome than the expansions with their mix of nasty supernatural foes. Opponents are still largely generic humans unless they're psychic opponents or these twitchy humans that climb on walls and ceilings. With the game's brighter, more comic booky art direction combined with the lack of hefty walkie-talkie voice modulation like the original game, your opponents don't seem as dangerous or fear-inspiring either. F.E.A.R 2 does introduce new foes that they call remnants, but I just call them stringy dudes, that will race around the level reanimating other dead enemies they run into until you kill them all dead. They're interesting, I guess. There are minor things to highlight too. Here's this guy who dies dramatically, but not in the fun way that they do in Star Wars Outlaws. Here's you killing Colonel Yannick, and as soon as you blow his head off, which is not the only time that you need to do this to someone in this game, he still carefully stumbles backward as if he still had a brain to maneuver his dead body to the ground. Melee always feels weird in these games, but it feels even more disconnected here, like you're swinging your controller in front of your TV and expecting the digital enemy to respond. Enemies will also just pop out of existence as soon as the game can dump them out of memory. The change in the combat is the single biggest reason why this game doesn't work as well as its predecessor, but it's still solid. It's just not as solid as the combat formula that the fame of the series kind of hinges on. To that end, there's some good stuff here. F.E.A.R 2's weapon mix is incredible with multiple death-dealing instruments that feel great. There's more fun gore and ragdolls here naturally. Thank you, better version of Havoc. Grenades are fun to use. The battle armor segments let you mow down tons of troops in a way that's not scary at all, but it is a hell of a lot of fun. These segments also have a thermal vision to highlight enemies because it had the nerve to come out 2 years before Red Faction Armageddon. Turret sequences return, but they're also more impactful and interesting. They're also not stuck inside boring office complexes. Shotguns also pulverize enemies much more effectively at close range. And on that note, let's talk about the next and final game in this trilogy that no one likes, not even the developers who made it. Before Vivendi would close out their spur of the F.E.A.R universe, they did have one last project in the pre-production pipeline. I'm making it a huge deal to mention, and then link in the description below, the documentary that Dead Domain put together about this slice of the franchise, featuring developers who were involved with its production. I highly recommend you check it out. As the story goes, and the timetable is a bit fuzzy, Day One Studios had been tasked, or had simply started working on, a full-on sequel to F.E.A.R, an actual F.E.A.R 2, alongside Timegate's twin expansions for the original game. Remember, Day One was the developer behind the original game's console ports, so they were experienced with not just the technical aspects of F.E.A.R, but its storyline too. Of course, that didn't matter too much since Vivendi didn't have the rights to expand on the storyline of the original F.E.A.R anyway. Instead, the F.E.A.R 2 that Vivendi commissioned Day One to develop featured truly alien enemies and environments. It expanded the series into a more grotesque Ghostbusters direction that leaned more on the supernatural than the contemporary and realistic. You can see how Vivendi wanted a more distinct direction for the series, not just because they legally and logistically had to, but because they wanted to sell more games with the commercially valuable F.E.A.R nameplate on it. At some point, Day One's F.E.A.R 2 was cancelled, and after the Activision merger, Vivendi gave up on F.E.A.R entirely, allowing Warner's to snatch up the naming rights again. Hence, Monolith's F.E.A.R 2. Despite that game's cliffhanger ending, Warner's deployed Monolith to work on other titles that weren't F.E.A.R 3. Instead, impressed by Day One's work on their cancelled version of F.E.A.R 2, Warner's brought them on to create F.E.A.R 3 as an extension and presumably resolution of Monolith's F.E.A.R 2. While it would no longer take place in the universe that Day One had created for Vivendi, it's not hard to see how some of the art and vision developed for it ultimately found its way into their conclusion of the F.E.A.R trilogy. It becomes clear between playing the game and watching Dead Domain's documentary with former Day One developers that everything related to F.E.A.R 3's shortcomings can be assigned to publisher Warner Brothers Games. Without a single specific vision for the game on how this story should conclude, because apparently Monolith had no plans themselves, they just left it hanging. Warner's treated this game as a built-to-order mass appeal product. Day One became the developer punching bag, having nearly every aspect of their work micromanaged for maximum return on investment. For starters, crafting the story was a clusterfuck. Warner's wanted celebrity horror fiction writers like John Carpenter and 30 Days of Night scribe Steve Niles. According to the Dead Domain doc, John Carpenter was involved as part of a few conference calls, but ultimately contributed nothing to the game. Niles was repeatedly late on deliverables, and then, well, you play the game and go, yuck. Warner's then further arced the series away from horror into more action-oriented territory by having Day One build a shooter that was heavily inspired by the faster-paced Call of Duty games, with extensive battle armor segments and epic action set pieces. This is also the third game in a horror series where, without precedent, Day One is ordered to thoroughly bake cooperative play into the campaign. It becomes apparent pretty quickly what had to be sacrificed to make that work. Like F.E.A.R 2, F.E.A.R 3 spends a lot of resources backfilling even more of what was going on in the original game story-wise. You slip back into the role of Point Man, the silent protagonist from the first game, who is now fashioned with a tough guy shampoo-free hairstyle and square jaw. All he needs is a Punisher logo somewhere on his gear. For reasons both understandable and absurd, he still won't speak, even as characters speak to him. So Fettel has to speak for both of them, even though no one else can hear Fettel except Point Man. Now that I say it out loud, that is really strange. Fettel, now canonically alive, isn't just a mustache-twirling antagonist, he becomes a kind of quippy buddy soldier, a far cry from the more chilling relationship they share in the first game. I mean, Fettel even points out the bullet hole Point Man gave him. Dead Domain's documentary explains that Day One faced a challenge in threading a narrative needle through a bunch of story requirements. First off, they had to establish the weight, importance, and even existence of their unholy brotherhood, because wrapping up this trilogy would lean heavily on it. The problem is that Monolith didn't reveal this fact until the last hour of the original game, and the second game didn't feature either of them, beyond the Reborn DLC. With Brotherhood in hand, the cooperative campaign mandated the entire story to be plotted around Fettel being your co-protagonist, even if you're playing it single player. That doesn't mean he's being controlled by AI, it just means he pops up in the cutscenes. In trying to resolve these issues, the game also explores what it was like for the brothers growing up, as they were being physically and psychically experimented on by their grandfather, Harlan. The story ultimately wraps around their mother giving birth to the baby conceived at the end of F.E.A.R 2 and preventing it from happening? Or at least intercepting the kid? I don't know. Day One also built cutscenes that alternate between their perspectives, as if two players are getting their fair share of time in the pre-rendered narrative bits. Warner's was so intent on ensuring that anyone who found this under their Christmas tree in 2011 would know what the hell was going on if they hadn't played the previous games, that the opening cutscene recaps what happened in those previous entries. It's even over-edited in that flashy style that kids loved on MTV back then. It's not hard to imagine a slightly different universe where these cinematics were lined with a chugga chugga butt rock soundtrack. As the game finally enters the first level, you'll discover that after the first game, Point Man had absconded to South America as the situation in Fairport deteriorated. If you have any respect for the game's lore, you may be wondering why F.E.A.R 3 opens in a dilapidated Brazilian prison and moves to the favelas from there. It's a fantastic question. Because of troubles Day One faced building the game, this became a critical slice of the story that they couldn't fit into the game. F.E.A.R 3 requires you to click on a lot of human bad guys, but Day One tries to mix them up thematically. Fettel's remaining replica troops have been absorbed by the sci-fi tinged and now hyper-militarized Armacam, whose troops now include supercharged boss commanders who can teleport, mechs, flying shit, and more. There are supernatural beasts toward the end as you'd get closer to Alma, something I still don't understand. For the first time in the series, the civilians of Fairport not only make an appearance, but kinda have an active role here. That's pretty good because the city is an actual place where people live that experienced a supernatural nightmare explosion, so there should be thousands of people that have been affected by your shenanigans in the first two games. Unfortunately, since this takes place some number of months or however long since the Project Origin Vault explosion, Fairport's fair citizens have been driven insane by Alma's psychic energy. In that time, masses of cultists have arisen, erecting shrines and drawing a lot of creepy artwork everywhere they travel. They must have had a brand and style guide because they all adhere to the same designs, including the creepy Alma face, no matter where you see them. They also seem to have access to a lot of red markers because, you know, all of it's red. Maybe red paint? One of this game's biggest victories has been seeing how these cultists have transformed the places where they live and visit. It's a slice of life that previous games ignored as they pushed you through warehouses and other places people don't normally go to. It allowed those games to operate in places that aren't so imprinted with human influence. Making a series of industrial corridors and then making them look worn down or broken is very different than detailing a couple houses in the neighborhood where people live and have their own tastes. It's something that F.E.A.R 3 tries to split the difference on as you march through the suburbs, but the illusion doesn't quite work as each house you visit is practically identical in structure and content. This transformation of civilians into psychotic cultists gains more color and definition when you realize that among their ranks of single-minded dashers and slashers, the cultists have true believers in the form of suicide bombers. It's pretty standard in horror swarm games, but as a concept, it's pretty fucked up. Compared to previous entries, there's a lack of hallucinatory sequences to make you feel like you're slightly out of phase with reality. In previous games, they served as the narrative trunk, connecting you to Alma and the alternate underdimension she resides in. Missing here, it feels more like you're watching the terrible things happening, not being a main character in it. F.E.A.R 3 also removes the series' voicemails and intel pads that work to fill in background story details. Sure, they were implemented a bit haphazardly, and they're a crutch even in the best case scenarios, but their complete absence here is telling of its action ambitions. In fact, F.E.A.R 3 has less interest in being immersive overall, as it delegates the vast majority of its storytelling to its pre-rendered chapter bookends. All these things combined, you don't feel as connected to Alma, who is literally your mom, like the Point Man did in the original game, or Beckett in the sequel. Nor does the story feel as substantial or important. Regardless of what you feel about how it tells its story, as a trilogy conclusion, it does work hard to wrap up a lot of loose ends. Primarily, despite what the first game looked and felt like, it's a story about family. This game features Harlan Wade as the Creep, a persistent quote-unquote enemy who is, I guess, the abstract manifestation of his will, or his memory and influence, despite him being physically liquefied at the end of the first game. F.E.A.R 3 doesn't really enlighten players about Harlan's motivations, it just highlights some of the terrible deeds he did to whittle his grandchildren down into psionic weapons for an imperialist superpower. Maybe he was going to get a pay raise or afford a bigger yacht if you could get their numbers high enough. F.E.A.R 3 also has the unique opportunity to feature characters from the 2 previous F.E.A.R games in one place. Jin, your F.E.A.R co-worker from the original game, does not meet the grisly fate she receives in the Extraction Point expansion, but holds up in anticipation of whatever the hell happens in this story. It also features Beckett from F.E.A.R 2, who, doesn't end well for him. And while these heroes from previous entries serve as campaign objectives at different points in the story, they're relegated to little more than minor parts at best and cameos at worst. What are you gonna do? Not play F.E.A.R 3? But now that the adventure is over, there are I have questions. Despite all of Armacam's cold industrial levels and laboratory settings in the series so far, it turns out that the Fettel brothers just grew up in a cabin in the woods. I mean, it's still a lab, it just looks like a generic horror setting from 80s slasher films. I don't know why they went this route, but okay. In a post-credit sequence, a young Fettel connects with his mom's, psychic vibe and murders a whole bunch of Armacam troops by causing their heads to explode. It might be the coolest sequence in the entire game and certainly a top 3 for the series, but it's buried so deep in this game that most people probably didn't even experience it. How fucking weird. Weirder still, after all this, they would still trust Fettel to lead an army, thinking that putting Alma in a coma and placing her in a big mitigating vault orb thing would be enough psychic shielding to prevent her from reaching out to her kids again. And yes, I know that Aristide reopened the vault, which kicks off the events of the original game, etc., etc. As you progress further into the game and the stakes get higher and levels become unglued with destruction, I kept wondering why these enemy forces would keep holding at their posts to try and stop you as their colleagues are burning up around them and dying in horrible ways. There's no hint of stress or anxiety in their chatter in the slightest that maybe they should get the hell out of town. This is offset somewhat by the hardcore Armacam operations setup, where it's clear that they're trying really hard to achieve their goals, whatever those are. And then we have the art, which also follows a series arc in terms of blossoming color and visual variety from the first game. Technically and artistically, it still looks good nearly a decade and a half later. Clearly, despite the development clusterfuck and corporate mismanagement, lots of care went into producing this. It's actually pretty creative all around. It just doesn't feel like a F.E.A.R game in terms of what the series has projected so far. There are lots of environmental details, making even the most mundane settings look pretty and interesting. Having Harlan's luminant face projected onto the forest hallucination scenes is really clever. In line with series expectations, the menus are very much of their era artistically, with console-friendly layouts and fly-in banners and rank-up pennants animating into frame regularly for reasons we'll talk about. As a ghost, Fettel has a persistent glow about him, similar to the animated glow of the gun pickups, which are not ghosts. I've buried the lead deep enough for you to probably come to the conclusion yourself. There's basically no sense of horror in this game at all. Yeah, the game has horror elements and tons of creepy shit, but neither Day One nor gamers thought the game was scary. You won't either. As a very action-oriented game, which we'll explore in a second, there was very little space for any kind of fearful tension to emerge. This becomes comically so playing co-op as you watch your partner's outline wander around levels like a deflating balloon. What might not seem silly from the first person definitely seems silly watching another human navigate the same environments with you. But even seeing Alma's young figure pop up in a flashback sequence seems more cringy than anything, like this not scare where she's just sliding down an airport people mover without any context, like a doll that had been placed there accidentally. honestly. I split my time with F.E.A.R 3 in half between the single player and a cooperative run with Mr. Shatsky of the Primordial Chronicles fame. Like I said earlier, go check out his channel and like and subscribe to his stuff, it's incredible. On that note, Patreon producer James Just a Bald Guy Wyatt had some thoughts about playing this game cooperatively. I love the co-op design of F.E.A.R 3 as I thought the two characters' abilities played well with each other. One had psychic powers and the other used guns. Rather than a tacked-on clone like so many of its contemporaries, co-op in F.E.A.R 3 was unique and fun, making you want to replay it for both character experiences. It had great jump scares, but they were not overdone. I remember some apartment complex thing that kept me and my buddy on our toes as we cautiously crept along. One level, I'm thinking an electronics store, had TVs turning off and on to great effect. Although admittedly, we always made a point to pronounce the game as F.E.A.R because of the stylized spelling. If the consoleization of F.E.A.R 2 was off-putting, then this game is going to throttle you. The fundamental changes to the gameplay, the controller-friendly menus, and the overall feel give this game a vastly different vibe than previous entries. Consoleization feels like an unremarkable standard these days since more people than ever have controllers synced up to their PCs, and developers have been natively developing cross-platform games because it makes financial sense, but considering the legacy of the series, it has a tight grip around this adventure. This isn't some dig one way or the other, but a reflection of how the series changed as time progressed. That said, I'll have a few notes about how this doesn't feel great as we go along. Playing to day one strengths, combat is fast and tight in F.E.A.R 3. The weapons are genuinely interesting and useful, keeping in line with series standards. My favorite is probably the riot shield / submachine gun combo that comes most of the way through the game. It almost feels unbalanced because you can use it to melee Armacham commanders into submission. Sniping feels great, and riot shield cheesing aside, melee feels good for the first time in the entire series. F.E.A.R 3 continues to amplify the number of enemy engagements per minute over F.E.A.R 2, making the original game feel like watching a glacier melt in comparison. This is a game that feels field-tested to annihilate boredom at any point, and always make you feel engaged. It's why I didn't really mind that it was a shorter experience than the other games. But similar to my critique of F.E.A.R 2, it also prevents the game from building much in the way of enigma or suspense. Augmenting F.E.A.R 3's console mode vibes is the inclusion of modal cover, turning this into a first-person Gears of War. This is a slightly different take on first-person cover than, say, Deus Ex Human Revolution, which launched 2 months later. Previous F.E.A.R games had cover in the pure geometric sense that you could hide your avatar behind a corner and peek out just enough to pick at enemies with gunfire. But this new mechanic for the series makes it easier to pick up and play and introduces some detracting nuances of its own. Regardless of what you feel about gameplay consoleization, it does allow F.E.A.R 3 to reintroduce leaning or firing from around corners because they're clearly defined through its new snap to cover mechanic, rather than a nebulous trick of 3D space. But while snap to cover was becoming a standard in so many other games during that era, it was irritating to have to snap in and out of it after playing the free-form previous games with keyboard and mouse. And then there's what feels like the continued watering down of the AI, which doesn't seem nearly as intelligent in this game. They can leap over obstacles and stuff, but they're rarely flanking you. They don't seem to be strategizing well. They're popping up like targets and you're shooting them. Shatsky kept calling opponents Call of Duty enemies, and I agree. It follows that the radio chatter, once a sturdy indicator of your enemy's intent and status, is useless too, feeling more like scripted noise than anything. We're going to talk about the levels holistically in a second, but while the level design is more complex as far as definition, complexity, and props, it doesn't allow the AI to shine. It lacks the braided layouts of those older games, so encounters feel more like extraction points ducked behind cover and shoot at enemies on the far side of a level design template. Likewise, the flashlight mechanic, a long-held feature of this series, feels diminished too. But perhaps the most irritating new component of the F.E.A.R 3 experience is the score-based meta layer that persists throughout the freaking game. The game is constantly pestering you about meta objectives you're completing as you go, which happens often, constantly popping up in the corner of your screen. You're unlocking achievements, you're collecting Alma dolls, and activating psychic links, meta objectives that provide robust replay value and inform system-level achievement systems, but make this feel more like a video game than than ever. You even see your quote-unquote performance at the end of each chapter, indicating if you are the favorite son, which is the better scorer in each chapter, whether you're playing cooperatively or not. This is designed this way because what ending you receive hinges on which character performed better through a series of arbitrary metrics. If you're playing single player, it's always whichever brother you're playing. Here's a hint, you only unlock F.E.A.R in each chapter by playing through it as Point Man first. It's so absurdly video gamey that it feels completely out of place, even if it does serve a long-term mechanical function. Speaking of levels, the locations here are so freaking interesting, even if they're clearly a concession to more conservative shooter gameplay with spaces designed to enable cooperative play. They're extremely linear, yes, but punctuated with small prismatic arenas where enemies can attack not just horizontally, but vertically as well. They're clearly planned with a second player in mind who can move around to flank enemies while you draw fire and vice versa. Thematically, these intervals are a mishmash of weird stuff designed around getting to the pregnant Alma, but they're also, thematically, kind of all over the place, for better and worse. The favelas seem like a strange place to play through in a F.E.A.R game for reasons I explained previously, but with all the radio chatter going on, it just feels like a B-rate Call of Duty campaign.
Forward's location of the Statue Plaza. Exact coordinates transmitting.
I knew about the Costco-like warehouse retail store in advance, but I didn't expect that it would be free of all the fun, imaginative parts of being in a retail store, where I worked in, on and off, for 15 years. Instead, it's almost 100% climbing through boring warehouses with improvised bridges and freezer sections that are far too fenced off to truly replicate the retail experience. It feels like an AI approximation of what a retail storefront is, crumpled up so tightly that it works as a shots per minute video game level instead of as a fun exploration of a mundane place a lot of people are familiar with. But then, wandering through the suburbs in and out of housing is pretty neat, even if they're cookie-cutter homes with some token cultist artwork. In the back half, as you approach the Alma Inferno in Fairport, it strangely seems to get further and further away, necessitating each subsequent level. It reminds me of that Stephen Wright photographer joke. Google it! It's a great bit! The airport interval is really interesting, weaving between commuter-facing public spaces and painted cinder block sections behind the scenes, highlighting process-intensive machinery and accessways designed to be out of sight. But despite the huge amount of effort put into building out the environments and making the terminals feel authentic, these levels funnel you down narrower and narrower paths, like the bridge level immediately before it, which undermines what's left of the appeal of F.E.A.R shooter gameplay. And then there's the actual co-op. Generally speaking, cooperative play, when designed well, is fun. It's a blast to work through a game together with another player, especially a friend. What it also does, unfortunately, is mitigate whatever storytelling power a campaign has because it's so easy to talk over narrative elements or the game will omit them entirely. Naturally, this affects the game's ability to do the actual scary game part of the scary game. In advance of playing this game for the first time ever for this review, I was told that your mileage will be limited if you don't play it cooperatively, and I don't quite agree with that. You can absolutely play the game single player, and it doesn't feel weirdly unplayable without a second person. There are artifacts though, like the incredibly unnecessary countdown launch when you start a single player campaign, or the arena-oriented level designs that throw enemies at you from all angles. While Point Man plays as you would expect, F.E.A.R plays differently as a ghost. He has a weak, supernatural attack that he can meekly fling at baddies, but he can possess enemies to use whatever they have, effectively using them as a meat shield until enemies dispatch him. He can also project a shield on Point Man to protect him. Playing together, you get to share a bigger bank of slow-mo, which is fun as battles become more intense. You also get the advantage of a second person to tackle enemies. But another trope of cooperative multiplayer is how much time you spend resurrecting your partner and being resurrected as the difficulty increases. Something you'll traditionally want to do in a cooperative campaign. You get a last man standing mode to pop off enemies as you die, but it's not enough to bring you back on its own, you have to wait for your partner to revive you. Character roles aside, the campaign structure is still a very linear experience. Your partner can get ahead of you, producing a nag message commanding you to scoot up. In the opening prison level, the game teases you and your partner about the possibility of asymmetrical roles, where F.E.A.R as Ghost can accomplish different objectives in different sections of the levels, but it makes zero commitment to this at all. 99% of the game is the two of you working side by side as you dispatch enemies. In retrospect, this seems like a narrative necessity, because either player can trigger an in-game cinematic moment or jump scare. If the other player isn't right there with you, they don't get to experience it. Even then, Shotsky would tell me about stuff he saw that I didn't. Still, I can't blame Day 1 too much for not being more imaginative about this because of all the other troubles they had just bringing the game to life with all of upper management's demands. But one thing that couldn't be easily forgiven was the arbitrary spikes in difficulty. In the case of Shotsky and me, it was a backyard fight that stopped us cold as we fought through the suburbs. We'd played the entire game to that point on the highest difficulty with few issues, but in this particular segment we were positively stumped. We played this section so many times that we practically memorized our movements and item pickups against when and where enemies were spawned, and we were still overwhelmed as we ran out of ammo and slow-mo to take out enemies. The only way through this was to dial down the difficulty and try again, at which point we took care of the encounter easily. Looking through comments elsewhere on the internet, it quickly became apparent that we weren't alone in our thinking that this section was a low point for the game. I realize that there are super players who could complete this backyard brawl single-handedly with a Guitar Hero controller, but we just didn't have it in us. Look, I'm a fan of co-op in nearly any game, and it is pretty well integrated and enjoyable here, minus some moments. But the mere fact that this series was contorted to make cooperative action work says a lot about why people don't care for this game, and why interest in this series flickered out with this installment. Like Red Faction Armageddon, it signals a creative dead end, far from the inspiration that made the series popular to begin with. Now that I've swan dived into all this F.E.A.R material, a series of 5 game releases produced over the course of a decade, it's not hard to see why people hail the original game as one of the greatest of all time, and why the nameplate fell so gradually and then entirely over the rest of its existence. People like F.E.A.R, love F.E.A.R, because it's the real deal. You can play this single game and be good. It was successful because of the technical prowess it demonstrated in that era, which also immediately dates it. It brings some interesting new scares to life in ways video games couldn't do before it. The gameplay's core loop is presented at the series' most interesting and tactical. The combat has weight and meaning, even though you're just gunning down generic military dudes in generic settings. The narrative is more of a tease than anything, providing more questions than answers because of a faulty, undertold story that's shrouded by the showmanship of a bunch of hallucinatory sequences. It helps that it made shooting dudes fun, and there are some memorable creepy moments. I could completely forgive how underbaked any individual element of this game is if it were about a third shorter, and it's not a long game to begin with. But when you have a successful game where the next step isn't terribly obvious, charting a path through the wilderness increases the probability of harm, and that's clear from all the corporate meddling that produced the middle chapter of F.E.A.R releases by 2 separate developers plotting vastly different paths from the original game. The F.E.A.R series shares issues with the Red Faction games, or even the Star Wars sequel trilogy. These were projects helmed by different crews of creatives that lacked a singular creative arc, who had to make it up as they went along. All the while, these games fought the corporate interlopers who were more interested in its value as a product with a commercially valuable name that resonated with consumers. But there's a huge problem with how they progressed either way. Alma isn't that interesting of a character. She's the series' big bad, but there's little to her persona or intent beyond her desire for revenge after the experiments dealt to her by her father. As a mute character, she is completely incapable of enunciating that herself, which means that she's little more than a prop to facilitate jump scares and random horror scary shit. And not just a prop that shifts in age and intention inexplicably to fulfill whatever method of horror they were trying to inflict on the player. Do we need a young scary girl Alma because of Japanese horror? Here you go. Do we need an old hag Alma because old people are scary? Here we go. Do we need a sexy Alma because... well, here we go. All this works hand in hand because why Alma is doing all this doesn't matter. If she can't explain why she's doing all this scary stuff, or summoning all these crazy scary demons of arbitrary design and killing all these people for arbitrary reasons, who cares? I mean, except me, the guy who crafted a segment in his System Shock review about that series' big bad, Shodan. The series doesn't want to explain much of anything. It's the J.J. Abrams mystery box approach of all set up and no plausible or satisfying way to continue from there. It's an afterthought, bleeding into the series of characters you encounter and actions you perform throughout these games. It's almost entirely flash and theater, flimsy setups for the game's only real elements of horror. But there are bones here, lots of potential. Armacam spends all this energy developing these projects with such little control over them, and it would have been fun if the series had explored this more. With a foundation made of jello, the games that follow speak for themselves. Okay, so who cares about the story? It's just window dressing to get you through the levels. Set that aside, and F.E.A.R's subsequent games faltered in different ways, never quite living up to the expectations of the original. After the treatment that Thief 2014 got as I reviewed it for the Big Thief series review I did a few years back, I thought it was bad mojo to say don't play a game when it's not actively setting your gaming hardware on fire or deleting the contents of your boot drive. But honestly, you can ignore the expansions. Not only do they not matter to the canon, what's there isn't told very well either, and they somehow mitigated the winning combat formula of the original game with painfully irritating levels despite adding some fun new guns. Monolith's F.E.A.R 2 is a great extension of the series. The console-oriented controls and interface combined with the new, more colorful art direction give it a different feel. It extends the story, but the combat isn't as sharp. If you played F.E.A.R and still needed more, sure, play the sequel. But F.E.A.R 3? Well, Giant Bomb's Ryan Davis probably said it best in his review. If F.E.A.R were a movie franchise, F.E.A.R 3 would be the direct-to-video sequel. Honestly, it might be just as appropriate, if not more so, to describe the expansions that way. There's clearly a lot of care in here on display as it tries to wrap up the wisps of this franchise's story, but it feels more like a ball of duct tape than genuine revelation. So it comes down to, if the story isn't great, and the strength of the gameplay becomes more diluted as you play through the series, are these games worth playing? And my answer is, do you truly have nothing better to do? Expansions aside, because they're miserable experiences, there are worse games to play, and these definitely had fun moments. But there are also genuinely good games that aren't being played that didn't have the big corporate push or budget or marketing that these games had. Why settle for less just because it's easier to bring up in a conversation or it's held greater clout in the zeitgeist? How much value is there in playing a game just because of a name slapped on the box or the characters inside? This isn't to diminish the skill or the talent of the developers of these games, but if Fate had simply ended F.E.A.R's ambitions with the first game hovering at its peak, would we truly have been at a loss? F.E.A.R's fatal flaw is that it's a victim of its own success. A winning formula was found and it resonated with audiences. That means money was to be made. Fields were to be sown, and so an extension of that formula was made. It's a tale as old as time. In the end, even as it tried its best to solve the mysteries it set out to create, it became a product, and the more apparent that became, the more gamers and critics tuned out. There's a much bigger conversation about the necessity of sequels and entertainment that can't happen here. Games like Video Game Story and the movies taught us that developing virtual products that people like makes it an easy choice to commercially extend the ones that work, to build on the sense of familiarity, to have a thing that's less risky after having a risk that finally paid off so you can afford the next set of risky bets and continue to live in your nice house. Each sequel, each extension, each DLC is a roll of the dice that can either endear fans and potentially bring more to the fold, or alienate them and toxify the brand entirely. Trade hands enough times, change the gameplay enough, drift in tone and intent enough, and even if it's a familiar name on the box, you risk overdoing it. That's what happened here. In the years since, horror has found a comfortable place in the den of budget title games from indie developers who set their scare houses inside Chuck E. Cheese-esque restaurants and condemned nostalgia factories. They've taken landmarks of American nostalgia and twisted them on their head to become truly terrifying visions that resonate with a new generation of gamers. If F.E.A.R needs to exist again, why not as a full-throated tactical adventure? Why not dive deeper into that angle? But none of it matters anyway. F.E.A.R is dead. It's difficult to imagine anyone coming back to revisit it at this point. It was art that struck like a hot hammer by being at the right place at the right time, by accomplishing what couldn't easily be accomplished. It's a once-in-a-generation novelty that would be impossible to reproduce now. Warners could produce more Alma storyline, they could re-enlist Point Man and his doofus brother, but why would they want to? To that end, why did they need to? Well, welcome to the end of the F.E.A.R review. Let me bring up my thing here. If you haven't already, like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. I do want to head off one thing. Maybe I didn't sell it enough in the outro. F.E.A.R 2 is a good game. It's pretty good. But my argument is, if they made nothing beyond that original game, things would still be really cool. So, it adds to the lore. It's solid gameplay. Not as solid, more or less solid than the original. But yeah, if it didn't exist, who cares? Honestly. Or if it was not F.E.A.R 2, if it was Project or if it was not related to Alma. I've already explained how often Alma doesn't matter in this game at all. Go watch my System Shock reviews. Got plenty of those. I want to thank my producers, James, freaking shaggy dogs. My producers, James Wyatt, John M., Christina Adams, Lee Kenyon, Mitchell, Romega, and Steve Brunwasser. Thank you so much for supporting me, and all of my Patreon supporters, whether you're assistant producers, Foam Finger fans, or if you're a free member. That's pretty dope too. So this is the first of what I want to call 3 projects this year. We're going to see how long. It's already freaking halfway through March, and I'm just getting this one out the door. But it helps when you're laid off. You have plenty of free time. Anyway, cool. Freaking shit. All right. Like and subscribe. Let's get out of here.